Hey, welcome back, friend. I am really glad you're here tonight. Settle in. Get comfortable. Maybe pull your blanket a little closer because tonight we are not going on a battlefield. We're not going to talk about generals or grenades or maps with big red arrows on them. Tonight we're going to sit down at the dinner table. And trust me, what happened at that table during World War II is one of the strangest, most heartbreaking, and sometimes surprisingly funny stories you have never been told. Because here is the thing nobody tells you about the biggest war in human history. Before anything else, it was a war about food. Who had it? Who did not? Who was willing to lie, steal, or trade their wedding ring for a stick of butter? And how 6 years of hunger quietly rewired the way an entire civilization eats, even to this day, even in your kitchen right now. So before we go any further, if this kind of slow, thoughtful storytelling is your thing, do me a small favor. Hit that subscribe button, drop a like if something tonight makes you think or feel or suddenly crave a warm meal at midnight. And hey, leave a comment, tell me where you are watching from right now. Are you in bed, on the couch? Is it late where you are, or are you one of those brave souls watching this at 2 a.m. with a bowl of cereal I love knowing? It makes the whole thing feel a little less like a monologue and a little more like a conversation between friends. Now, turn the lights down soft if you can. Let the night settle around you, and let me take you somewhere very specific. September the 1st, 1939. A Friday morning. The sun had barely come up over the fields of western Poland when the first German shells began to fall. It was 4:45 in the morning, most people were still in bed. And within hours the world as everyone knew it was gone. World War II had begun. But here is what I want you to hold in your mind tonight. Not the bombs, not the headlines, not the politicians making speeches. I want you to think about breakfast. Because somewhere in Warsaw that morning a woman was standing in her kitchen making bread. A simple loaf. Rye flour, water, a little salt the way her mother had taught her. The dough was rising on the windowsill. The kettle was heating on the stove. Her children were still asleep. She did not know, could not have known that this ordinary, unremarkable morning meal was the last completely normal breakfast her family would eat for 6 years. By 1942, that same loaf of bread would be rationed, replaced, and eventually adulterated with things that have absolutely no business being inside bread. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let us go back to a world that still remembered what full felt like. The 1930s before the war were not an easy decade for most of the world. The Great Depression had already knocked millions of families into poverty. But even in lean times, there was a rhythm to eating, a logic, a comfort. In an ordinary American home in, say, 1938, dinner might have been pot roast on Sunday, chicken soup on Monday, maybe a meatloaf on Tuesday, stretched with breadcrumbs to make it go further. Families kept a small garden in the backyard. Mothers canned vegetables in the summer. Nothing was wasted, but nothing was forbidden either. In Britain, the average working-class family ate well enough bread, margarine tea with milk, some bacon on weekends if they could afford it. Not glamorous, but nourishing, predictable, safe. In France, food was practically a religion. Baguettes fresh from the boulangerie every morning. Wine with dinner even in modest households. Cheese, real cheese. The kind with names that take 3 attempts to pronounce correctly. The French had built an entire national identity around the pleasure of eating well. In Germany, despite the rising political tensions, the average German family was eating better than they had in decades. Adolf Hitler's government had made a very deliberate point of this. After the humiliation and hunger of World War I, where food shortages had fueled riots and revolution, the Nazi leadership was obsessed with keeping German civilians well fed. Full stomachs, they understood, meant compliant people. and in Japan the traditional diet of rice, fish, miso soup and pickled vegetables had sustained one of the most disciplined and efficient populations on Earth for centuries. Every table in every country had its own story, its own smell, its own sound, the clatter of dishes, the whistle of a kettle, a grandmother calling children in from the yard. And then one by one those sounds began to change. Here is a fact that I think about a lot, and I want you to really sit with it for a moment. World War II did not begin everywhere at the same time. It crept in. It arrived differently depending on where you lived. For Poland, it arrived violently all at once on that September morning in 1939. For Britain, the real hunger did not begin immediately. It built slowly like water rising in a basement. For Americans, the war felt distant until December the 7th, 1941, when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor in Hawaii, and suddenly everything changed overnight. But in almost every case, whether the war arrived like a flood or like a slow leak, the first thing people noticed, the very first concrete change in their daily lives, was not the soldiers in the streets. It was not even the blackout curtains on the windows. It was what was on the dinner table, or more precisely, what was not. In Britain, the government began rationing food in January of 1940. That is less than 5 months after war was declared, and the system they built was remarkably, almost ruthlessly mathematical. Every person received a ration book, a small, humble document maybe 3 inches by 5 inches, filled with little coupons that you would surrender at the shop each week in exchange for your allowed portion of food. Now I want you to picture this for a moment, because the numbers are genuinely startling. Each adult in Britain was entitled per week to roughly 4 ounces of bacon or ham, that is about the weight of a small apple, 2 ounces of butter, 2 ounces of tea, 1 ounce of cheese, which is about the size of your thumb, 1 egg, and a small amount of sugar, milk and cooking fat per week. That was it. Now I know what you're thinking. You are thinking, okay, but that is just the ration stuff, right? Surely there was more food available. And yes, technically, some things were not rationed vegetables, for instance, and bread, at least in the early years. But availability was a completely different question from legality. Shops had empty shelves. Distribution networks were disrupted. And as German submarines began hunting British supply ships across the Atlantic, even the things that were theoretically available began to disappear. Britain imported 55 million tons of food per year before the war. By 1942, that number had been cut nearly in half. The ocean, which had always been Britain's highway to the world's food supply, had become a graveyard. And now here is the part of this story that I find genuinely remarkable. The part that I think says something important about human beings and what we do when our backs are against the wall. People adapted, not just survived adapted, got creative, got clever, sometimes got a little desperate and occasionally got a little ridiculous. In Britain, the government launched one of the most extraordinary propaganda campaigns in history, not about bombs or victory or glory, but about vegetables. Specifically about a fictional character named Dr. Carrot and his friend Potato Pete. Dr. Carrot was a cheerful, smiling cartoon carrot. Potato Pete was a jolly little potato with a face. They appeared on posters in newspapers, in recipe pamphlets distributed to millions of households. Their entire purpose was to convince the British public that eating more carrots and potatoes was not a sign of poverty and deprivation, it was an act of patriotism. And it worked. But here is the part that most people do not know. The British government also spread a deliberate rumour, a myth that became so widely believed it is still repeated today. They claim that the reason their Royal Air Force pilots were so extraordinarily accurate at shooting down German planes at night was that they ate enormous quantities of carrots, which had given them exceptional night vision. The whole story was a lie A clever, beautiful, totally fabricated lie. The real reason British pilots were so effective at night was a secret technology called radar. But the government did not want the Germans to know about radar. So they invented the carrot story instead. And civilians across Britain, desperately wanting to do their part, began eating more carrots than they ever had in their lives. I genuinely love this story because it captures something true about wartime eating. It was never just about nutrition. It was about morale, about meaning, about turning scarcity into something that felt against all odds like purpose. Meanwhile, on the other side of the Atlantic, Americans were living a slightly different version of the same story. The United States entered the war in December of 1941, and rationing followed quickly, though the American system was notably different from the British one. In Britain, rationing was about strict weekly limits. In America, it operated partly on a point system where certain foods had point values, and families received a monthly allowance of points to spend however they chose. Sugar was rationed first in May of 1942, partly because so much of the American sugar supply came from the Philippines, which was now under Japanese occupation. Then came coffee, gasoline, butter, and eventually meat. Now the American ration was significantly more generous than the British one by most measures. But that does not mean Americans felt no pinch, particularly in middle-class households that had just begun to recover from the Depression and were starting to enjoy a little abundance. The sudden restrictions felt like a step backward, like something had been taken from them. And yet, there is something in the historical record from this period that I find genuinely moving. Public surveys from 1942 and 1943 show that the vast majority of Americans, somewhere between 70 and 80%, reported that they were complying with rationing voluntarily, not because they were forced to, but because they understood why it was necessary. They were choosing to eat less so that soldiers on the other side of the world could eat enough. That is a remarkable thing when you stop and think about it. Now, I have been talking about Britain and America, and I want to be honest with you, these are in some ways the easier stories to tell. Because in these countries, rationing was uncomfortable, sometimes genuinely difficult, but it was survivable. It was managed by governments that were, broadly speaking, trying to keep their people alive. There is another set of stories from this same period that are much darker, and we will get to them, I promise. We will talk about the hunger winter in the Netherlands, where people boiled tulip bulbs for soup in the winter of 1944. We will talk about the siege of Leningrad, where 900 days of blockade reduced human beings to eating things that I can barely bring myself to describe. We will talk about the deliberate starvation of people in occupied territories, used not as a side effect of war but as a weapon of it. But tonight, in this first chapter, I want us to start here, in the ordinary world, in the kitchen that still smelled like real bread and real coffee and something warm on the stove, because I think that is the right place to begin a story about what happens when ordinary things disappear. The woman in Warsaw standing at her kitchen window in the early morning of September, the 1st 1939, watching the first smoke rise on the horizon. The British housewife carefully cutting her weekly 2 ounces of butter into 7 tiny portions, one for each morning's toast, making it last, making it matter. The American family sitting down to a slightly smaller Sunday roast, looking round the table at each other, not saying what they were all thinking, that somewhere far away someone they did not know needed it more. These are the stories that history tends to forget. The quiet ones, the kitchen ones, the ones that happened not on battlefields but at dinner tables where ordinary people made extraordinary decisions day after day about how to keep going when everything familiar was slipping away. And that is exactly where this journey is going to take us. Because the story of what people ate during World War II is not just a story about food, it is a story about human resilience, about creativity in the face of desperation, about the strange and surprising ways that hunger shapes a people, not just their bodies, but their choices, their values, and the traditions they carry, long after the war is over. We have only just sat down at the table. The meal has barely begun. Coming up next, we are going to pull back the curtain on one of the most complex and quietly ruthless systems ever designed, the official machinery of rationing. We're going to look at exactly how governments across the world decided who got to eat what, how much, and why. And we are going to meet the people who tried to cheat the system and the ones who paid the price for it. Stay right here. The story is just getting started. All right? So we just talked about what the world was eating before everything changed, that warm, ordinary world of Sunday roasts and fresh baguettes and rye bread rising on a windowsill in Warsaw. Now I want to ask you something, and I mean this genuinely. Have you ever stood in a grocery store staring at an entire aisle of cereal, 47 different kinds of cereal, by the way, 47, and felt completely overwhelmed by how much there is to choose from? Hold on to that feeling, because what I am about to describe is the precise opposite of that experience. And understanding it, really sitting with it, might change the way you see a simple trip to the supermarket for the rest of your life. Imagine waking up one morning and being handed a small booklet, about the size of a paperback novel printed on thin, slightly yellowed paper. Inside page after page of tiny perforated squares, each one a coupon, each one representing your legal right to purchase a specific amount of a specific food for 1 week. This was the ration book, and during World War II it was without exaggeration one of the most important documents a civilian could own. Lose it, and you did not eat. Damage it, and the government was not particularly sympathetic. It was your passport to food, and like any passport, it told a very clear story about who you were and what you were worth. Here is where it gets complicated, and honestly a little dark. Because not everyone's ration book was the same. In Britain, the rationing system launched in January of 1940 was on the surface designed to be fair. Every civilian received the same allocation. The aristocrat and the factory worker, the banker and the coal miner on paper, they stood equal at the butcher's counter. And that principle of equality was genuinely radical. It was almost revolutionary. Britain before the war was a deeply class-stratified society. The wealthy ate well, the poor did not. Rickets, a bone disease caused by malnutrition, was still common among working-class children in British cities as late as the 1930s. Malnutrition was not a wartime invention in Britain. For many families, it was just Tuesday. So when the Ministry of Food announced that every person would receive the same weekly ration, regardless of income, something genuinely interesting happened. The health of the poorest British citizens actually improved during the war, not because there was more food, there was considerably less, but because for the first time there was guaranteed food. Consistent food. Food that showed up every week, even if it was not much. Dr. John Boyd Orr, a Scottish nutritionist who would later win the Nobel Peace Prize, had been warning for years that a significant portion of the British working class was chronically undernourished. The war, with all its horror, accidentally corrected that. I think about that often. The idea that a catastrophe can force a society to do something it should have done all along. But let us not get too romantic about rationing, because the system had teeth. The mathematics of the British weekly ration, and I want you to really picture this, looked something like this. One adult received roughly 4 ounces of bacon or ham. That is approximately 113 grams, or about the weight of 2 standard chicken eggs. 2 ounces of butter, 1 ounce of cheese, 4 ounces of margarine, 3 pints of milk, 1 egg, and even that was not guaranteed every week, and a small sugar allocation of about 8 ounces. Now, if you are doing mental calculations right now, you are correct, that is not very much. A single modern American fast food meal likely contains more calories than what a British civilian was officially allocated for an entire day. And here is the thing about those ration numbers: they were the ceiling, not the floor. The rationed amounts were the maximum you were legally permitted to buy, not the minimum you were guaranteed to receive. If the shop ran out, you got nothing and you were not compensated. The British government published something called the Ministry of Food Bulletin, a weekly newsletter-style document stuffed with cheerful suggestions for how to make the most of your rations. It recommended dishes like mock banana mashed parsnip, flavoured with banana essence. Woolton pie, named after the Minister of Food himself, Lord Woolton, which was essentially a pastry crust filled with whatever vegetables happened to be available: potato, turnip, swede, carrot, oat, with a sauce made from vegetable water and rolled oats. It was by most accounts not wonderful. One housewife of the era described it in her diary, and this quote has stayed with me as tasting like the inside of a very polite disappointment, which is honestly one of the most eloquent food reviews I've ever read. Terrible food, beautifully described. Now, something I want to be clear about, because I think the American experience of rationing is often misunderstood. When the United States entered the war in December of 1941, the American government faced a genuinely different challenge than Britain had. Britain was a small island nation heavily dependent on imports facing direct military threat from German submarines hunting its supply lines. America was a continental nation with enormous agricultural resources, largely protected from direct attack. So American rationing was not primarily about domestic scarcity, it was about redirection. The question was not whether America had enough food, it did overwhelmingly, but whether American citizens would voluntarily consume less so that more could be shipped to Allied soldiers and civilian populations in Europe. That is a fundamentally different moral proposition, and the American government knew it. The rationing system introduced in 1942 operated on a point system that gave consumers a degree of choice. Families received books of red and blue stamps, red for meat, butter and fats, blue for canned and bottled goods. Each item in a shop had a point value, and families could choose how to spend their monthly allocation. Want to use all your points on canned peaches? Technically your choice. The weekly meat ration for an American adult settled at roughly 28 ounces, nearly 4 times the British bacon and ham allowance. Coffee was limited to £1 every 5 weeks per person over the age of 15. Sugar was rationed to about 12 ounces per week. By any comparative measure, American rationing was an inconvenience rather than a hardship. And yet, and this is the part that I find genuinely fascinating from a psychological standpoint, it created enormous anxiety in the American public. Letters to newspapers from this period are full of genuine distress about the coffee ration. Housewives wrote to their congressmen about butter. There were small-scale protests about sugar, which raises a question worth sitting with. Does the experience of scarcity feel the same whether you're going from abundance to moderate restriction, or from poverty to genuine hunger? I suspect the answer is no. I suspect that losing something you'd always taken for granted feels disproportionately large, even when the objective loss is small. Human psychology is strange like that. We're not very good at measuring suffering in absolute terms, but here is where I need to take you somewhere very different, because we have been talking about Britain and America, democracies, countries, where rationing was implemented as a social policy, explained to citizens, enforced through law, and administered with at least the intention of fairness. In Nazi-controlled Europe, the ration book told a completely different story. In the territories occupied by Germany, rations were explicitly designed not for equality but for hierarchy, and the hierarchy was vicious. The German occupation authorities in Poland, the Netherlands, France, and elsewhere issued different ration cards to different categories of people, based entirely on their racial and political classification, under National Socialist ideology. In occupied Poland, and these numbers come from historical records preserved after the war, a Polish civilian of what the Nazis classified as German heritage received a daily caloric allocation of approximately 2,300 calories. A Polish non-Jewish civilian received roughly 900 calories. A Jewish Polish civilian in a ghetto received approximately 184 calories per day. 184 calories. To put that in context, a single medium apple contains roughly 95 calories. 184 calories is approximately the energy content of a thin slice of bread and a spoonful of jam. That is not a diet. That is not a ration. That is a slow sentence. The Warsaw Ghetto at its height contained over 400,000 people living within an area of slightly more than 1 square mile. The official ration allocated to them by the German administration was deliberately calculated to produce mass starvation over time. Historians who have studied this period extensively have documented that the Nazi bureaucracy was fully aware of the mortality projections implied by those caloric numbers. It was not an oversight. I want to be careful here because I know we are listening to this together in the quiet of evening. This is not easy material, but I think it is necessary, because understanding what food meant in World War II requires understanding that for some people, food was a weapon used against them, not a comfort, not a policy challenge, but a calculated instrument of destruction. Let us breathe for a moment and come back to something slightly less harrowing, though not entirely cheerful either. Germany itself. Here is a fascinating tension at the heart of the Nazi state. The German government was paradoxically obsessed with keeping its own civilian population well fed precisely because it had studied the collapse of German morale during World War I. In World War I, the British naval blockade had cut off Germany's food imports. By 1917 and 1918, ordinary German civilians were starving. The average German civilian was consuming fewer than 1,000 calories per day by the final year of that war. This hunger, widespread, visible, humiliating, contributed directly to the collapse of public support for the German government, and many historians argue to Germany's eventual decision to seek an armistice. Adolf Hitler had watched this happen as a young man. He had absorbed the lesson completely. When he came to power, he made an explicit political promise German civilians would not go hungry in the next war. And to keep that promise, Germany extracted food from every territory it occupied. The food that was taken from French farms, from Dutch warehouses, from Polish fields, it went to Germany. It fed the German civilian population. It kept German mothers from standing in bread lines, and German workers from losing faith in the regime. The occupied peoples of Europe were in effect feeding their occupiers and starving in their place. This is one of the most uncomfortable truths about this period. The relative comfort of German civilians during the early years of the war was not accidental. It was purchased at a direct and devastating cost to the people Germany had conquered. Now you might be wondering, and this is a very reasonable thing to wonder, what happened when people could not survive on their official rations alone. The answer almost universally was that they found other ways, and those other ways were sometimes brave, sometimes criminal, sometimes tragic, and occasionally almost absurdly creative. In France under German occupation, a shadow economy of food developed almost immediately. Farmers who were required to surrender set quantities of their harvest to German requisition officers began hiding portions of their crops. Urban families with relatives in the countryside developed elaborate systems of exchange. City goods for country food smuggled in bags and coat linings on the train from Lyon or Bordeaux to Paris. In the Netherlands, people cycled into the countryside on their days off specifically to trade jewellery, clothing, and household valuables for food with farmers. This practice became so common it had a name: hunger travel. Thousands of people making these quiet, desperate journeys every week, trading the material evidence of their former lives for a bag of potatoes. And in every occupied city across Europe, the black market grew. We will spend much more time in that shadow economy in the chapters ahead, because it is a world unto itself with its own rules, its own moral logic, and its own extraordinary stories. But for now, I just want to plant that seed. The Ration book was the official story of wartime food. What happened outside it was a whole other story entirely. There is one last thing I want to leave you with from this chapter, and it is something I've been thinking about for a long time. We tend to look at rationing as a form of deprivation, and it was obviously. Nobody enjoyed it, nobody chose it. But there is another way to read the history of wartime rationing, particularly in the democratic countries, that I find genuinely moving. It is this: for possibly the first time in modern history, millions of ordinary people in wealthy nations voluntarily accepted a reduction in their own consumption for the explicit purpose of helping people they would never meet. They did not know the soldiers who would eat the food they gave up. They did not know the children in Britain's poorer neighbourhoods whose health improved because of more equitable food distribution. They could not see the direct line between their smaller butter ration and the warm meal in a mess tent somewhere in North Africa or the Pacific. They just did it. Because they were asked to. Because it seemed right. Because the alternative, continuing to eat normally while others sacrificed everything, felt to most of them like a kind of moral failure they were not willing to live with. There is a word for that, and the word is solidarity. And it is rarer than we like to think. But solidarity, it turns out, has its limits, and courage has a price. Because while some people were voluntarily tightening their belts out of principle, others were risking their lives, sometimes very literally, to feed their families through channels that were decidedly less legal. What we've just covered is the official machinery of wartime food. The ration books, the points systems, the Ministry of Food pamphlets with their cheerful mock banana recipes and politely disappointing pies. What comes next is the other world. The one that ran underneath it in back alleys and farmhouse cellars and whispered conversations at the edge of the market square. The world of the black market, where a single stick of butter could cost more than a week's wages, where trust was currency, and where the line between survival and crime dissolved so completely that most people stopped seeing it at all. Stay with me. There is a particular kind of courage that history rarely celebrates. Not the courage of soldiers charging across a field, not the courage of a general making a decision that will cost thousands of lives. I mean the quieter kind, the kind that happens at 2 a.m. in a cold kitchen, when a mother is deciding whether to feed her children something she obtained illegally, knowing full well what could happen if she is caught. That is the courage we're going to talk about now. Let me paint you a picture of Paris in the autumn of 1941. By this point, the city had been under German occupation for more than a year. The famous boulevards were still beautiful. The architecture does not care who occupies a city, but something had gone very wrong beneath the surface. The cafes were open, but the menus were thin. The market still had stalls, but the stalls were increasingly empty. Parisians who had built a civilization around the pleasure of eating well were discovering what it felt like to be genuinely hungry in one of the greatest food cities on earth. The official ration for a French civilian adult at this time hovered around 1,200 calories per day. For context, a moderately active adult needs somewhere between 2,000 and 2,500 calories to maintain basic body weight. 1,200 calories is what nutritionists today would classify as a very low-calorie diet, the kind used in medically supervised programs for significant rapid weight loss. Except in Paris in 1941, there was no medical supervision, there was no end date, and there was no choice. Or rather, there was one other choice, and everyone knew where to find it. The black market in occupied France was not a secret. It was an open secret, which is an entirely different thing. Everyone knew it existed. The German occupation authorities knew it existed. The French police knew it existed. The neighbourhood baker knew it existed. The question was never whether the black market was real. The question was always the same uncomfortable one: how far were you willing to go, and how much were you willing to risk? In French it was called the marché noir, and by 1942 it had grown into a parallel economy of staggering scale. Historians who have studied this period estimate that somewhere between 30 and 40% of all food consumed in urban France during the occupation years moved outside official rationing channels. Nearly half of what people ate was obtained illegally. Let that number settle for a moment. Nearly half. This was not a fringe activity carried out by criminals at the edges of society. This was ordinary people, teachers, factory workers, doctors, grandmothers, participating in systematic daily illegality simply to eat enough to function. And the prices were extraordinary. In Paris in 1942, a kilogram of butter on the black market cost approximately 80 francs. The official controlled price was around 30 francs. A kilogram of real coffee, not the ersatz grain-based substitutes we will get to shortly, could cost 400 francs or more. A single chicken, which before the war might have been an everyday purchase for a middle-class family, now commanded prices that would consume an entire week's wages for a working person. To afford these prices, people sold things. They sold furniture, they sold jewellery, they sold books, clothing, silverware, the accumulated possessions of generations. Pawnshops in Paris did extraordinary business during the occupation years. There is something deeply sad about that image, a family dismantling its history piece by piece, trading heirlooms for calories. Now I want to introduce you to someone. She is not famous. You will not find her name in most history books. But her story, preserved in the archives of a French historical research project on everyday life under occupation, is the kind of detail that makes the history of this period feel real to me, in a way that statistics alone never quite can. Her name was Marguerite. She was a schoolteacher in the 14th arrondissement of Paris. She was 43 years old in 1942, widowed with 2 daughters aged 12 and 9. Margaret kept a journal throughout the occupation years, and in that journal she recorded with almost painful precision what her family ate every day. The entries are devastating in their smallness. Tuesday bread with margarine potato soup, no meat. Wednesday bread, boiled cabbage, 1 egg shared between 3. Week after week, the same rotating cast of inadequate ingredients. And then, in March of 1942, a new kind of entry appears. Obtained ½ kilo of pork from the man on Rue Daguerre. Did not ask questions. Made a ragout for the girls. They ate everything and asked for more. I cried after they went to sleep. She did not ask questions. 4 words that contain an entire moral universe. Marguerite was not a criminal. She was not reckless or dishonest by nature. Her journal makes this absolutely clear. She was a woman who had reached the specific point where watching her daughters go to bed hungry was more painful than the fear of what might happen if she was caught buying food illegally. And across occupied Europe, millions of people were reaching that same point, making that same calculation every single day. The mechanics of the black market were fascinating in their ingenuity, because this was not a simple matter of going to a back alley and handing money to a shady figure in a coat. The wartime black market was a complex, layered, genuinely sophisticated supply chain. At the bottom were the producers, primarily farmers in the countryside, who had something that urban populations desperately wanted. A farmer with 20 chickens and a vegetable garden was in the wartime economy a person of considerable power. Farmers were required by law to surrender fixed proportions of their harvest and livestock to German requisition officers. Many of them did comply at least partly, but many also developed elaborate systems of concealment animals not listed in official inventories, harvests, underreported food hidden in cellars and hay bales and false walls. This was not without risk. German authorities conducted regular inspections of farms in occupied territories, and farmers caught concealing produce faced serious consequences: fines, confiscation, and in more serious cases, arrest. In Poland and the Soviet Union, the consequences of hiding food from German requisition could be far more severe than in Western Europe, but the risk calculation for a French farmer who had hidden 3 pigs was very different from the risk calculation for the urban family who needed to feed children on 1,200 official calories. Both were taking risks, but the farmer at least had the food. The city family had nothing to fall back on. In between the farmer and the urban consumer sat the intermediaries, the réseau, the networks. These were the people who moved food from the countryside into the cities. Some were professional smugglers, people who had been operating in grey markets before the war, and had simply shifted their operations to meet new demand. Others were ordinary people who happened to have the right connections: a cousin with a farm, a friend with a truck, a neighbour who worked for the railways. The railways were particularly important. An enormous amount of black market food moved into Paris and other occupied cities on the regular passenger trains, carried in bags and suitcases by ordinary travellers. The Germans were aware of this and conducted spot checks. But the sheer volume of people moving through major railway stations every day made comprehensive inspection impossible. Travellers developed techniques: food wrapped in clothing to disguise the smell, butter packed inside hat boxes lined with newspapers, live rabbits which were technically unrationed stuffed into bags under seats, occasionally with predictable and chaotic results. Here is a question I genuinely want you to think about, because I have thought about it a lot. When does survival become complicity? The black market in occupied France was not morally simple. On one level, it was ordinary people finding creative ways to feed their families in the face of an unjust and brutal occupation system. On another level, it was a system that the German occupation authorities tolerated and sometimes quietly encouraged, because a black market that allowed French civilians to feed themselves without official resources took some of the administrative pressure off the Germans. There are historians who argue, and I find this analysis persuasive, that the scale of the French black market actually served German interest to a degree. The occupation authorities did not have to worry as much about urban food riots or mass civilian unrest, because the safety valve of illegal trade was releasing enough pressure to keep the population functional. Was the French civilian who bought black market butter participating in their own oppression, or were they simply surviving? Is there even a meaningful distinction when the choice is between principles and your children eating? I do not think there is an easy answer, and I am genuinely suspicious of anyone who offers one. The German experience of black markets was perhaps unsurprisingly different in character. Germany rationed food from the very first day of the war, September, the 1st 1939, which was actually earlier than Britain. The Nazi leadership, as we touched on before, was pathologically anxious about domestic food security, and the ration system was designed to prevent shortages before they happened. In the early war years, German civilian rations were genuinely relatively generous by wartime standards. An ordinary German adult received about 2,000 calories per day in 1940, notably higher than what French civilians under occupation would later receive. But as the war extended and the military situation deteriorated, German civilian rations declined steadily. By 1944, they had dropped to around 1,500 calories. By the final months of the war in early 1945, they were collapsing towards starvation levels in many regions. But here is the aspect of the German black market story that I find most historically interesting, and that is rarely discussed: the enforcement. The Nazi state was ideologically committed to the idea of racial and national solidarity. Buying or selling on the black market was not just a crime under German law, it was framed as a betrayal of the national community, a selfish act that undermined the collective sacrifice of the German people. And the penalties reflected that framing. German civilians caught operating significant black market businesses could face not just fines or imprisonment, but in the most serious cases charges that carried the possibility of capital punishment. Between 1939 and 1945, German courts handled hundreds of thousands of cases related to food violations. Most resulted in fines or short prison terms, but a meaningful number resulted in sentences of extraordinary severity, particularly when the accused was Jewish, or a foreigner, or otherwise already outside the protection of the state's ideological hierarchy. The same act, buying butter illegally, could earn a German housewife a fine and a warning, and earn a Jewish German resident a prison sentence. The law was identical on paper. Its application was not. Meanwhile, something different was happening in Britain. British black markets existed, obviously. Human nature being what it is wherever there is scarcity and price control, someone will find a way to profit from the gap. But the British black market was meaningfully smaller in scale than its French or German counterparts, and the reasons for that are worth understanding. Part of the explanation is practical. Britain's rationing system was overall more efficiently administered than the occupation systems in continental Europe. Supply chains, while stressed, were better maintained. Shortages were more predictable. The point system gave consumers enough flexibility that the frustration driving people toward illegal markets was somewhat lower. But I think there is also a cultural explanation, and it is one that the British themselves were very aware of at the time. There was a genuine and widespread sense, documented extensively in the mass observation surveys conducted throughout the war. These were detailed sociological studies of British public opinion and behaviour, remarkable documents that participating in the black market was a form of letting down the boys abroad. That sounds sentimental. Maybe it is. But the survey data is actually quite striking. British civilians, when asked directly whether they had purchased goods on the black market, consistently reported lower rates than researchers expected based on the economic conditions. And when they explained their reasoning for not doing so, a significant number specifically cited the fairness argument: if everyone has to manage on the same ration, it is wrong for me to get more than my share. That is not economics talking. That is ethics talking. I want to end this chapter on an image that has stayed with me since I first encountered it. In the winter of 1942, a journalist working for an American newspaper managed to spend several weeks in Lisbon, Portugal, one of the few remaining neutral cities in Europe, a strange intersection point where refugees, spies, diplomats, and black market traders all move through simultaneously. Lisbon was in a sense the last place in Europe where you could still buy almost anything if you had the money. This journalist described walking through the Lisbon market and seeing side by side two women. One was clearly wealthy, well-dressed, unhurried, buying expensive food items, with casual ease loading a basket with things that had disappeared from the rest of Europe's tables. The other was a refugee from somewhere in Central Europe wearing clothes that had once been good but were now worn thin, counting coins in her palm with a focused concentration of someone for whom the difference between buying and not buying was the difference between eating and not eating. Both women, the journalist wrote, were buying butter. Same butter. Completely different worlds. That image to me is the black market in miniature. Not good people or bad people. Not heroes or villains. just human beings navigating an impossible situation with whatever resources they happened to have, which as always was never the same for everyone. The black market fed millions of people who might otherwise not have survived. It also entrenched inequalities, created opportunities for exploitation, and allowed those with resources to insulate themselves from suffering that others could not escape. It was, in short, a very human thing, complicated, morally ambiguous, occasionally heroic, frequently troubling and entirely understandable given the circumstances. But here is something that will probably surprise you. While all of this shadow trading was happening, while families were dismantling their furniture for food money, and farmers were hiding pigs behind false walls, and train passengers were smuggling butter in their hat boxes, something else entirely was also underway. In kitchens across Britain and America and Germany and Japan, people were not just finding illegal food, they were also doing something far more creative, far more strange, and in some ways far more revealing of the human spirit. They were reinventing food itself. When the real ingredients disappeared, people did not simply stop cooking. They started experimenting. They substituted improvised and occasionally produced results that would make a modern chef either weep with respect or just weep. The world of wartime ersatz food, replacement food, substitute food made from things that have absolutely no business being food is its own extraordinary story. And it is exactly where we are going next. So we just talked about the black market, the shadow economy that fed millions of people through back channels, whispered deals and hat boxes stuffed with contraband butter. But I want to stop here for a second and ask you something personal. Have you ever opened your refrigerator, stared at a full shelf of ingredients, and still felt like there was nothing to eat? I think most of us have. And I think if we are being honest with ourselves, that feeling says something uncomfortable about how far removed we are from the actual experience of hunger. Not inconvenience, not cravings. Real hunger, the kind where your body starts negotiating with itself about what counts as food. Because that negotiation, that slow, creative, sometimes desperate process of redefining what food actually is exactly what happened across an entire civilization during World War II. And the results were stranger, more ingenious, and more revealing of human nature than almost anything else from this period. Welcome to the world of ersatz. The German word ersatz means substitute or replacement. It entered the English language during World War I when German civilians first began replacing scarce commodities with improvised alternatives. By World War II, the word had become so associated with wartime deprivation that it carried its own emotional weight, a mix of resourcefulness and resignation, of making do with something that everyone knew was not quite right. Ersatz food was not unique to Germany. Every country in the conflict developed its own vocabulary of substitutes. But Germany, which had been planning for a long war since the mid-1930s and had invested heavily in synthetic and replacement industries, took ersatz further than almost anyone else. The German state had learned from the catastrophic food shortages of World War I. This time they were prepared, or at least they thought they were. Let us start with coffee. Coffee is by most measures one of the most beloved beverages in human history. And it is also one of the first things that disappears in wartime because it has to be imported, and it is not remotely essential to survival, which makes it an obvious early target for rationing and restriction. Germany had been largely cut off from reliable coffee imports even before the war began due to foreign exchange shortages and trade restrictions. By 1939, real coffee was already something of a luxury. By 1941, it had essentially vanished from ordinary German households. What replaced it was called Muckefuck. This is a real word. I did not invent it. Muckefuck was a catch-all term for various grain-based hot beverages made from roasted barley, chicory, root, rye, acorns, or Whatever combination of available materials happened to produce a dark-coloured liquid that was vaguely hot and could be poured into a cup. It did not taste like coffee. Everyone knew it did not taste like coffee. The manufacturers knew it did not taste like coffee. The government knew it did not taste like coffee. And yet a remarkable thing happened. People drank it. Every morning, millions of German households prepared and consumed something that resembled coffee the way a cardboard replica resembles a house structurally suggestive, functionally present, emotionally hollow. There is a particular kind of human stubbornness in maintaining rituals even when the substance of those rituals has been replaced entirely. The act of making something hot in the morning, pouring it into a cup, holding it with both hands, those gestures carried their own comfort independent of what was actually in the cup. I find that genuinely moving, the ritual outlasting the substance, the form persisting after the content has gone. But coffee substitutes were in the grand taxonomy of ersatz food relatively benign. Let us talk about bread. Bread is not just a food. It is in most of the cultures involved in World War II something close to foundational, culturally, emotionally, almost spiritually significant. The French have their baguette. The Germans have their dense, complex rye loaves. The British have their sandwich bread. Americans have their soft white sliced loaves. In every case, bread is not merely sustenance, it is identity. And in nearly every country involved in the war, bread was adulterated. The process began subtly. Governments and bakers facing flour shortages began extending wheat flour with other materials. In Britain, a wartime loaf called the National Wheatmeal Loaf was introduced in 1942. Darker than the white bread people were used to made from flour that retained more of the wheat bran and germ which had previously been milled away in the production of white flour. The government framed this as a health improvement. Nutritionists pointed out correctly that the darker flour actually contained more vitamins and fibre than refined white flour. The British public, broadly speaking, hated it. The complaints were remarkable in their intensity. People wrote letters to newspapers. They complained to their members of parliament. The social historian Angus Calder documented this episode in detail, noting that the hostility to brown bread was not really about taste. It was about what white bread represented. White bread was modern. It was clean. It was prosperous. Brown bread was what poor people ate. Eating brown bread felt to many British civilians like sliding backward into a poverty they had worked their whole lives to escape. The government responded with a propaganda campaign arguing that brown bread was superior. Nutritionally, they were right. Culturally, they were fighting against something much larger than a preference for pale toast. Germany went considerably further than brown bread. By 1942, German military bakers were producing field bread Kommissbrot that contained not just mixed grains but also potato flour, soybean flour, and in some formulations a small percentage of wood pulp processed to extract digestible starches. Wood pulp in bread. I want to be accurate here. The wood pulp used was processed cellulose, treated chemically to break down some of its fibrous structure. It was not nutritionally useful in the way that grain is, but it added bulk. It made the bread heavier and more filling in the short term, even if it provided minimal actual caloric value. The soldiers who ate this bread knew what was in it. They were not deceived, and the accounts from German soldiers and civilians who consumed it are remarkably consistent. It was edible. Barely. It had a texture that one former soldier described in a post-war memoir as similar to damp cardboard that had been left in the sun, and that man had clearly thought carefully about the comparison, because it is accurate in a way that reveals genuine familiarity with the product. Now let us cross the English Channel and visit what was happening in kitchens on the Allied side, because the ingenuity here was no less remarkable. It was just pointed in slightly different directions. In Britain, the Ministry of Food, which had taken on an almost comic level of cheerful authority over the nation's eating habits, published an extraordinary series of recipe booklets throughout the war years. These were not suggestions. They were in the gentle but firm British tradition, strongly worded encouragements, and the recipes within them represented a genuine attempt to make severely limited ingredients into something that a person might actually want to eat. The results were mixed. One recipe that appears in multiple wartime British publications is for a dish called mock goose. It contained no goose. It contained no poultry of any kind. It was made from sliced potatoes and apple layered with sage and onion stuffing, covered with a small amount of grated cheese if available and baked until golden. The Ministry of Food apparently believed, or at least publicly insisted, that the result bore a meaningful resemblance to roast goose. It did not. But here is what I find interesting about mock goose, and about the entire genre of wartime mock dishes. They reveal something deep about human psychology and the role that food names play in our experience of eating. When you call something mock goose, you're making a promise that you cannot keep. You're asking the eater to engage in a kind of collaborative fiction, to participate in pretending that what they are eating is something other than potato and apple. And some people found that helpful. The ritual of a Sunday roast, the gathering of family around a table, the presentation of something that at least gestured toward the shape of a special meal that had value independent of whether the food itself delivered. Others found it depressing, a reminder of absence rather than a celebration of presence. Across the Atlantic, American home cooks were engaging in their own creative improvisations, driven by a slightly different set of constraints. America, as we've established, was not in genuine food shortage the way Europe was, but certain specific ingredients were restricted, and American cooks attacked the challenge of working around those restrictions with characteristic enthusiasm. Sugar rationing produced some of the most creative substitution experiments. American cookbooks from 1942 and 1943 are full of recipes using corn syrup, molasses, honey, and saccharin as sugar replacements. Saccharin, a synthetic sweetener that had been commercially available since the early 20th century, was suddenly enormously popular. It had no calories, no rationing implications, and a slightly chemical aftertaste that most wartime cooks were willing to tolerate. The results in baking were, by general historical consensus, not entirely successful. Saccharin behaves very differently from sugar when heated. It does not caramelize, it does not help create structure in baked goods, and in significant quantities, it produces a bitterness that is difficult to mask. Wartime American cakes made with saccharin were reportedly denser, less golden, and less satisfying than their pre-war equivalents. But they existed. They were made with care and effort and served, and eaten and appreciated because the alternative was no cake at all. And no cake at all was for many American households a more psychologically difficult proposition than slightly suboptimal cake. Here is something that I think gets overlooked in most discussions of wartime food, and it is a point I feel strongly about. The improvisation, the substitution, the creative reinvention of familiar foods from unfamiliar ingredients. This was not just a coping mechanism, it was an act of cultural preservation. When a French cook in occupied Paris spent 3 hours making a cassoulet from turnips and a small amount of dried beans with no duck, no pork, no proper stock, using ersatz ingredients and considerable imagination, she was not just feeding her family. She was maintaining a connection to a culinary identity that the occupation was trying in 100 subtle ways to degrade and diminish. Food in this sense was resistance. Not the dramatic, celebrated resistance of the Maquis fighters in the mountains, but the daily quiet, insistent resistance of people who refused to let their cultural identity be entirely stripped away, who continued to cook the dishes of their heritage even when they had almost none of the actual ingredients, who set the table properly, and used the good dishes even when what was on those dishes was a pale shadow of what should have been there. I find that form of resistance deeply moving, maybe more moving than I can adequately explain, because it speaks to something that I think is both very human and very easily overlooked: the refusal to let scarcity become the whole of who you are. Not everything from this era of culinary improvisation was dignified, though, and I want to be honest about that. In Germany, by the final years of the war, the situation had gone well beyond creative substitution into something much grimmer. By 1944 and into 1945, German civilians in bombed cities were eating things that would have been unthinkable even 5 years earlier. There are documented accounts from Berlin in the winter of 1944 to 45 of civilians boiling leather belts and shoe soles to make broth. Not because leather is nutritious in any meaningful sense, but because the act of boiling something and producing a hot liquid that smelled faintly of something organic felt in the extremity of that moment like eating. There are accounts of people rendering the fat from whatever animal sources they could find: rats, pigeons, stray cats to use for cooking. I'm not sharing these details for shock value. I am sharing them because they represent a specific truth about what prolonged severe food restriction does to human priorities and human dignity. The German civilian population in the final year of the war was experiencing something that had nothing to do with rationing policy or Assat's innovation. They were experiencing collapse, the collapse of a food system that had been maintained partly through the extraction of resources from occupied peoples, and which had finally run out of both the resources and the peoples to extract them from. There is a grim justice in that trajectory that I do not think needs elaboration. Let me bring us back to something slightly more hopeful, because this chapter would not be complete without acknowledging the ways that wartime food improvisation genuinely produced lasting innovations. Spam. Let us talk about Spam. Spam was not invented during World War II. It was first produced by the Hormel Foods Corporation in 1937. But the war transformed it from a moderately successful canned meat product into something approaching a global cultural phenomenon. Spam is cooked pork shoulder and ham combined with salt water, modified starch and sodium nitrite sealed in a can and shelf-stable for years. It required no refrigeration, no preparation beyond opening the can, and contained reasonable protein and calories. For military logistics, planners dealing with the challenge of feeding soldiers in remote locations without reliable cold storage, Spam was close to ideal. The United States supplied approximately 100 million pounds of Spam to Allied forces and civilian populations during World War II. Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev later wrote in his memoirs, and this is a genuine historical quote, one that Khrushchev included with apparent sincerity, that without American canned meat, the Soviet army would have had serious difficulty feeding its troops during the most critical phases of the fighting on the Eastern Front. The product that Khrushchev was referring to was in significant part Spam. Hawaii, which was the closest American territory to the Pacific Theater, and housed enormous military installations, received so much Spam during the war that it became embedded in local food culture in a way that persists to this day. Hawaii currently consumes more Spam per capita than any other state in the United States. The product appears in local dishes in restaurants and convenience stores as a normal and beloved ingredient. That is a wartime food legacy that is still alive right now in the present day. Every time someone in Honolulu orders a Spam musubi, and they order a great many of them, they are participating in a very small and delicious way in the food history of World War II. The powdered egg deserves a mention here as well because it represents perhaps the most universally disliked wartime food innovation across all the Allied nations. Powdered eggs were produced by spraying liquid egg through a heated nozzle to create a fine dried powder that could be reconstituted with water. They contained essentially all the protein and most of the nutrients of fresh eggs. They were shelf-stable, easy to transport, and relatively inexpensive to produce. On paper, they were an excellent solution to the problem of getting egg protein to large populations without the logistical nightmare of transporting fresh eggs. In practice, they were almost universally despised. The reconstituted texture was wrong, slightly grainy, with a quality that one British housewife described in a recorded interview as resembling rubber that had become confused about whether it wanted to be an egg. The colour was a slightly unnatural shade of yellow. The smell when cooking was distinctive in a way that was not entirely pleasant, and yet people ate them. By the millions every day across Britain and in army mess halls from North Africa to the Pacific. They ate them because protein matters, because the body does not care about texture when it needs nutrition, and because when the alternative is nothing slightly wrong, is still something. What strikes me most, looking at the full landscape of wartime food substitution, is not the hardship, though the hardship was real, and in many cases severe. What strikes me is the creativity. Human beings faced with the removal of almost everything familiar from their tables did not simply stop eating or stop caring about food. They thought. They experimented. They shared recipes. They published pamphlets. They wrote letters to newspapers with tips for making turnip taste less like turnip. They held cooking demonstrations in church halls. They traded techniques with neighbours. They refused to let the absence of good ingredients mean the end of the effort to eat well. That is a very specific and very human response to adversity, and it produced alongside the deprivation and suffering an extraordinary body of culinary knowledge about what food actually is at its core, not just the ingredients, but the intention, the care, the act of making something for someone else. A bowl of turnip soup made carefully by someone who was doing their best with what they had for a child who was hungry, that is still food. It is still nourishment in every sense of the word. But there is another dimension of wartime eating that we have not yet touched, and it is one that I think fundamentally changes the moral landscape of this entire story. Because everything we have talked about so far, the rationing, the black markets, the ersatz coffee and the mock goose and the powdered eggs, all of this has been primarily the story of civilians on the home front, people managing scarcity from their kitchens with their ration books in their own homes. We have not yet sat down to eat with the people who were doing the actual fighting. Because the food experience of a soldier in World War II was something entirely different, again shaped by different logistics, different priorities, different dangers, and in many cases a relationship with hunger and with eating that would stay with those men for the rest of their lives. That is where we are going next, into the mess tins and the foxholes, and the extraordinary strange, sometimes darkly funny world of what soldiers actually ate, from the carefully engineered ration kits of the American military to the desperate improvisation of soldiers on the Eastern Front, where the line between a meal and a miracle was sometimes very thin indeed. Pull your blanket a little closer. This next part of the story gets cold. Cold is the right word, because I want you to imagine something specific. Not a battlefield, not the noise and chaos that war movies give you. Something quieter than that, more ordinary, more human. Imagine a young man, 22 years old, sitting in a hole in the ground somewhere in the forests of Belgium in the winter of 1944. It is 3 a.m. The temperature has dropped to somewhere around -20 degrees Celsius. He has not slept properly in 4 days. His boots are wet. His hands are so cold that he's not entirely sure he can still feel his fingers, and in his hands he's holding a small rectangular tin. He is staring at that tin the way a person stares at something that represents the entire difference between going on and not going on. He is not thinking about the war. He is not thinking about home or his mother or the girl he left behind. He's thinking about whether the contents of that tin are still frozen solid, and if so, whether he can find enough warmth somewhere on his body to thaw them before morning. That tin is his dinner. It is also his breakfast. It is also in a very real sense the thing that is keeping him alive. This is the story of what soldiers ate. And it is stranger, more complicated, and more deeply human than almost anything else I know. Let us start with the Americans, because the American military approach to feeding its soldiers was unlike anything the world had seen before, and understanding it tells you a great deal about how the United States approached the war as a whole. By the time America entered the conflict in December of 1941, the United States Army had already been studying the problem of field feeding for several years. They had nutritionists, food scientists, and logistics experts working on the question of how to deliver adequate calories to a soldier. In combat conditions that might include extreme heat, extreme cold, physical exhaustion, limited cooking facilities, and the constant possibility of having to move at a moment's notice. The solution they developed came in several forms, each designed for a different situation. The most famous was the K ration, developed primarily by a physiologist named Ansel Keys, who would later become one of the most influential nutritionists of the 20th century for his work on diet and cardiovascular health. The K ration was designed to be compact enough to fit in a soldier's jacket pocket, light enough not to add significant weight to an already heavy combat load, and calorie-dense enough to sustain a man through a day of moderate combat activity. A standard K ration came in 3 small boxes: breakfast, dinner, and supper. The entire day's supply weighed roughly 31 ounces or just under 900 grams. Inside, spread across those 3 boxes, a soldier would find a compressed meat product of some kind, often a form of processed pork or beef, some crackers, a compressed cereal bar, a small amount of hard candy, a few cigarettes, water, purification tablets, chewing gum, instant coffee or bouillon, and a tiny 4-pack of toilet paper. The daily caloric value was approximately 3,000 calories, which sounds adequate until you consider that a soldier in active combat carrying equipment and moving through difficult terrain can burn anywhere from 4,000 to 6,000 calories per day. The K ration was designed as a short-term emergency ration intended to sustain soldiers for a maximum of around 15 days. In practice, soldiers on prolonged combat operations sometimes ate almost nothing else for months. Now I want to ask you something, and I mean this as a genuine question, not a rhetorical one. If someone handed you a small tin of processed pork, some crackers, that had been compressed under industrial pressure into something resembling a small brick and a piece of hard candy and told you that was dinner, how do you think you would feel? The answer, based on the overwhelming testimony of soldiers who actually ate these rations, is grateful. Deeply surprisingly, sometimes emotionally grateful, because the alternative, which many of them had already experienced, was nothing, or worse than nothing. A soldier from the 82nd Airborne Division, one of the American parachute units that dropped into Normandy in June of 1944, wrote in a letter home that he had once eaten a K ration biscuit, so slowly chewing each piece so many times, making it last so deliberately that the single biscuit took him nearly 40 minutes to finish. Not because he was savouring the flavour, because he was extending the experience of eating, because eating even badly, even inadequately, was one of the few things in his daily experience that still connected him to something recognisable as civilian life. That detail has stayed with me for years. The 40-minute biscuit. It says everything about what food means when it becomes scarce, not just nutrition, but normalcy. Not just calories, but continuity with who you were before. The C ration was the other major American field feeding system, and it was considerably heavier and more varied than the K ration. Where the K ration was designed for soldiers on the move, the C ration was intended for troops in more stable combat positions, who had slightly more time and equipment available. A sea ration came in a set of cans, one containing a meat component, one containing crackers, sugar instant coffee, and a small amount of candy or fruit. The meat options rotated, theoretically between a small number of varieties meat and vegetable stew meat, and beans, frankfurters, and beans, pork and beans, ham and lima beans. The ham and lima beans deserve special mention because it occupies a unique place in American military culinary history. It was by the overwhelming consensus of the soldiers who ate it the worst thing in the entire rotation. Not bad in an interesting way, not bad in a way that becomes funny over time, just profoundly, stubbornly, impressively unpleasant. Veterans of this era interviewed decades later would still make a specific face when the subject came up, a face that combined resignation, mild distaste, and a kind of nostalgic horror that only people who've eaten something truly terrible can fully understand. There is a genuine historical footnote here when the sea ration was updated for use in later conflicts. The ham and lima beans survived essentially unchanged well into the 1970s. Generations of American soldiers ate it and hated it. It became a kind of bonding experience, a shared grievance that crossed unit lines and theatre boundaries. Everyone had eaten the ham and lima beans. Everyone had opinions about the ham and lima beans. But the American experience of military feeding, even at its worst, existed on an entirely different planet from what soldiers on other fronts were enduring. Let us go east. Much further east. The Eastern Front, the conflict between Germany and the Soviet Union that stretched from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea and consumed more human life than any other theatre of the war, had a food situation that defies easy description. The German military had planned its invasion of the Soviet Union, launched in June of 1941 on the assumption that it would be over in roughly 12 weeks. The planning was extraordinarily confident, perhaps the most catastrophically overconfident military planning in modern history. German soldiers were issued summer equipment for a campaign that the generals expected to conclude before the cold came. The food logistics reflected that confidence. German soldiers in the early weeks of the Eastern Front advance were relatively well supplied. Field kitchens moved with the units. Hot food, a military luxury of the highest order, was available with some regularity. Soldiers ate reasonably well by the standards of active combat. And then the Soviet Union did not collapse, and autumn came, and then winter came, and German supply lines stretched across thousands of kilometers of destroyed roads and sabotaged railways began to fracture. By the winter of 1941-42, the first winter on the Eastern Front, German soldiers were experiencing food shortages of a severity that their high command had simply not planned for. Field kitchens could not always reach forward positions. Hot food became a rarity, then an exception, then a memory. Soldiers subsisted on whatever could be transported in frozen blocks and eaten cold, or on whatever they could find locally. And local, in the occupied Soviet territories in winter, meant very little. There is a document that I find remarkable, a collection of letters written by German soldiers on the Eastern Front, assembled by a German historian named Wolfram Wetter, and analysed in the 1990s. These letters, written home to families and never intended for any audience other than the recipient, provide an extraordinary window into the day-to-day experience of food on that front. One soldier, writing from somewhere outside Moscow in December of 1941, described a meal of frozen bread so hard it had to be hacked apart with a bayonet, and a thin soup made from melted snow and a small piece of horse meat. He wrote, "I have been thinking about what Mother's potato soup smells like. I can remember it exactly. I have been going over every detail in my mind to make it last longer." That sentence. I have been going over every detail in my mind to make it last longer. Here is a young man using the memory of a meal as a form of mental nutrition. sustaining himself partly on recollection, eating in some sense with his imagination when his body had almost nothing to work with. I don't know how to read that without feeling something. I do not think you are supposed to. The Soviet soldiers on the same front were experiencing their own version of deprivation, though the Soviet military food system operated on principles very different from the German or American approaches. The Soviet military had a formal ration system, but its implementation was wildly inconsistent. In theory, a Soviet frontline soldier was supposed to receive a daily allocation. That included bread, roughly 900 grams, a substantial amount, along with a portion of meat, fish or canned goods, fat sugar, and various vegetables. Tea and tobacco were also officially included. In practice, what any given soldier actually received on any given day depended almost entirely on where they were, what was happening around them, and whether the supply chain that was supposed to reach them had survived whatever was between it and the front. During the siege of Stalingrad, the massive urban battle that raged from August of 1942 through February of 1943, and which historians widely regard as the turning point of the war on the Eastern Front, Soviet soldiers defending the city were supplied by a single ferry route across the Volga River, running under constant German fire. The amount of food that could be delivered through this corridor was wildly insufficient for the number of men who needed it. Soldiers defending Stalingrad have described in post-war memoirs and interviews eating things that are difficult to categorize as food under any conventional definition. Sunflower seeds, raw grain recovered from bombed warehouses, horses that had been killed in the fighting, butchered and eaten on the spot. In one particularly striking account, a Soviet soldier described finding a cache of mustard seed in a bombed factory and mixing it with water to make a kind of paste that provided at least some calories and the feeling, however illusory, of having eaten something with flavour. Mustard seed paste in the ruins of Stalingrad in winter. The Japanese military food system occupies its own distinct and deeply troubling place in this history. The Japanese Imperial Army operated on a principle called Jikyu-jisoku, which translates roughly as self-sufficiency. The idea was that soldiers in the field should be capable of foraging, growing, and otherwise producing a significant portion of their own food supply, rather than depending entirely on central military logistics. This principle had a certain practical logic in the specific contexts of earlier Japanese military campaigns. But in the vast geographically diverse and logistically nightmarish theatre of the Pacific War, it became something far more sinister in its consequences. Japanese soldiers on Pacific islands, cut off from supply lines by American naval dominance, were expected to feed themselves in environments that were often completely unsuitable for the kind of subsistence agriculture the doctrine assumed. The result was that Japanese garrison troops on islands across the Pacific faced some of the most severe starvation of any military force in the entire war. Historians who have studied the Japanese military experience in the Pacific have documented the systematic failure of the Jikyu-jisoku approach in devastating detail. On numerous islands, the majority of Japanese casualties were not caused by combat. They were caused by starvation and the diseases that accompany it, primarily dysentery, malaria, and beriberi, a disease caused by severe thiamine deficiency that was directly linked to the Japanese military's dependence on polished white rice as a primary food source. Beriberi had been a known and preventable condition for decades by the time of World War II. The connection between polished rice and the disease had been established by Japanese military doctor Kanehiro Takaki as far back as the 1880s, and yet the Japanese military continued to supply polished white rice as its primary staple, partly for cultural and partly for logistical reasons, and its soldiers continued to develop beriberi in enormous numbers throughout the Pacific campaign. That is a tragedy with a particularly painful quality, a preventable catastrophe caused partly by institutional stubbornness in the face of known medical evidence. Let me bring you back to that young American in his foxhole in Belgium. Back to the tin in his frozen hands. He eventually thaws it tucked under his armpit for 20 minutes, which is a technique that American soldiers developed through collective experience and shared obsessively as practical wisdom. He eats it cold because he has no way to heat it and no time to wait. It is meat and vegetable hash, and it tastes by any objective measure of almost nothing except salt and metal. He eats every single bite. And then he puts the tin carefully aside because the empty tin is useful. You can melt snow in it for water. You can use it to scoop mud. It is in the economy of a soldier's possessions still valuable even after the food is gone. That careful, deliberate reuse of an empty tin, that refusal to waste even the container, is something I keep coming back to. It speaks to a relationship with food and with material things that most of us, in our current lives, will simply never have. A relationship forged in the specific crucible of scarcity, of cold, of fear, and of the knowledge that what you have right now might be all there is. There is one more dimension of soldier feeding that I want to address before we move on, because it is one that I think reveals something genuinely important about the psychology of warfare. Food among soldiers in World War II was not just fuel, it was ritual. It was one of the primary remaining connections to civilian identity, to home, to the person each soldier had been before the war remade them. Soldiers who received food packages from home, and the postal systems of World War II moved an extraordinary volume of food parcels. Despite the chaos of global conflict, treated those packages with a reverence that went well beyond their caloric value. A tin of cookies from a mother in Ohio, a jar of jam from a family in Yorkshire, a small package of dried fruit from a wife in Melbourne. These things were not just food. They were proof that somewhere a specific person was thinking of a specific soldier, that he existed in someone's mind as more than a uniform and a serial number. Soldiers shared these packages with their units, sometimes because sharing was the only way to prevent resentment, sometimes because sharing was genuinely what they wanted to do, sometimes because the act of eating together, even badly, even inadequately, was one of the few remaining human rituals available to them. There are accounts from veterans of multiple armies who describe the sharing of food as one of the most significant bonds of their military experience. Not the fighting, not the danger, not the camaraderie of battle, but the sitting together with something to eat, however small, and dividing it fairly, and for a moment feeling like people rather than weapons. Food, as we have now seen across 4 countries and multiple fronts, was never just food in World War II. It was power, and it was policy, and it was survival, and it was resistance, and it was ritual, and it was memory, and it was in the most fundamental sense the thread connecting every human being in this conflict, soldier and civilian, victor and victim, to the most basic fact of being alive. We need to eat. All of us. Always. And what we do when that need cannot be easily met tells us more about who we truly are than almost anything else. But we have been talking throughout these chapters about something that I want to name directly. Now we've been talking about what people ate. We have not yet talked in any depth about what the act of eating or not eating did to their bodies, to their health, to their minds. Because the medical and physiological story of wartime hunger is its own extraordinary chapter, and it begins with an experiment that took place not on a battlefield, not in a bombed city, but in a university gymnasium in Minnesota, where 36 young men voluntarily chose to starve themselves in the name of science, so that doctors might understand how to help the millions who had no choice in the matter at all. What those men experienced and what it revealed about what hunger actually does to a human being from the inside is something that changed medicine permanently, and it is one of the most quietly remarkable stories to come out of the entire war. Picture a university gymnasium in Minneapolis, Minnesota. The year is 1944, Outside, the war is consuming the world. Young men are dying on beaches in Normandy, in jungles in the Pacific, in the frozen rubble of bombed European cities. The newspapers are full of casualty lists and battle maps and the grinding arithmetic of a conflict that shows no sign of ending soon. Inside this gymnasium, 36 young men are doing something that on the surface sounds almost mundane. They're eating lunch. Except that lunch for each of them every single day consists of approximately 1,570 calories, a small bowl of turnips, some black bread, a little macaroni, occasionally a modest portion of potatoes. That is it. For 6 months. These men are not prisoners. They are not being punished. They volunteered for this. They chose it deliberately, knowing exactly what they were agreeing to because they believed with a sincerity that I find genuinely moving, that what they were suffering in that gymnasium might help save the lives of millions of starving people in Europe when the war finally ended. This is the story of the Minnesota starvation experiment. And what it revealed about hunger, about what it actually does to a human being from the inside, changed medicine, changed our understanding of the human mind, and produced findings that are still reshaping how we think about eating and the body more than 80 years later. The man behind the experiment was Dr. Uncle Keyes, the same physiologist who had developed the K-ration for American combat soldiers. Keyes was by 1943 deeply preoccupied by a problem that he could see coming from a distance. When the war ended, the Allied armies were going to liberate millions of people who'd been starving for years, and nobody, not the military, not the medical community, not relief organizations, had any reliable scientific understanding of what severe long-term starvation actually did to the human body, or how to safely reverse it. The medical knowledge available at the time was fragmentary and largely anecdotal. Doctors knew that starvation caused weight loss. They knew it caused weakness. Beyond that, the picture was surprisingly unclear. Keyes wanted to change that. He wanted to create under controlled conditions a documented scientific study of what happens when a human being is systematically underfed, and then critically what happens when you try to refeed them. He needed volunteers, and he found them among a community that in the context of 1944, America was itself in a morally complex position. The 36 men who ultimately participated in the Minnesota starvation experiment were conscientious objectors, men who had refused military service on moral and religious grounds, primarily Mennonites and members of other pacifist faith traditions. They had been assigned to what was called civilian public service, performing non-military work in hospitals, farms and other settings as an alternative to combat service. Many of them felt acutely and uncomfortably that while other men their age were dying in service of a cause, they believed in their own contribution to that cause was limited. When the opportunity to volunteer for a genuinely dangerous scientific study was offered to them, hundreds applied. 36 were selected. The experiment ran in 3 phases. The first phase, 12 weeks, was a control period during which the men ate normally and were extensively measured and documented. Their weight, their physical fitness, their psychological state, their cognitive function, their social behavior, all of it was recorded in meticulous detail. This was the baseline. This was what a healthy, well-fed young man looked like. The second phase, 24 weeks, was the semi-starvation period. Each man's daily caloric intake was reduced to approximately half of what he had been eating, calibrated so that each participant would lose approximately 25% of his body weight over the course of the period. The diet was deliberately designed to resemble what was actually available to starving civilians in wartime Europe. Primarily turnips, rutabagas, potatoes, bread and macaroni. Protein was minimal. Fat was almost entirely absent. The third phase was refeeding the recovery period, during which the researchers carefully monitored what happened as the men were gradually given more food. What happened during those 24 weeks of semi-starvation is what I want to spend some time with, because the findings were not what anyone expected. And they matter. They matter deeply to understanding the human experience of wartime hunger at every level. The physical changes were the ones everyone anticipated. The men lost weight, an average of around 16 kilograms or roughly 35 pounds, bringing most of them to states of visible and significant emaciation. Their hearts slowed, their body temperatures dropped, their physical endurance collapsed. Men who had been fit and active at the experiment's start found themselves exhausted by tasks as simple as climbing a single flight of stairs. Their hair began to fall out. Their skin became dry and cracked. They felt cold constantly, even in heated rooms, because their bodies had reduced metabolic activity to conserve whatever energy remained. These physical changes were expected. They were the visible, measurable consequences of insufficient calories, and they confirmed what doctors had broadly assumed about the physiological effects of starvation. What nobody had quite anticipated were the psychological changes, and those changes were in some ways far more disturbing than the physical ones. Within the first few weeks of the semi-starvation phase, the men's personalities began to shift in ways that the researchers documented with growing astonishment. Men who had been described by their peers and by the research staff as cheerful, sociable and engaged became withdrawn, irritable and profoundly inward-focused. Social connections, friendships that had developed during the control phase began to dissolve. The men stopped initiating conversation. They stopped participating in group activities. They sat alone and were quiet. And then the obsession began. Food became quite simply the organizing principle of every conscious moment. The men talked about food constantly, not because they chose to, but because they could not stop. They swapped recipes. They described meals they had eaten years ago in precise sensory detail. They collected cookbooks. Several men who'd shown no prior interest in cooking whatsoever began to talk seriously about pursuing careers as chefs or restaurant owners after the experiment ended. One participant began cutting out food photographs from magazines and pinning them to the wall above his bed. Just photographs, images of food he could not eat arranged in a kind of shrine. When a researcher asked him about it, he said he could not explain it exactly. He just found it comforting to look at them. I want you to think about that. A young man so consumed by hunger that looking at photographs of food provided genuine psychological comfort. Dr. Keyes and his team noted something that I find one of the most psychologically significant findings of the entire study. The men's capacity to think about almost anything other than food had been severely compromised. Their ability to concentrate on reading conversation, intellectual tasks, all of it was dramatically reduced. Their mental world had contracted around food the way a fist contracts around something it refuses to let go of. One man described it in his journal. These journals were collected by the research team and preserved as feeling as though food had become the gravity of my mind. Everything else orbits around it, but it is always the center. The gravity of my mind. Written by a man in a university gymnasium in Minnesota who'd been eating turnips for 4 months. Now here is the question I want you to sit with for a moment, because I think it is one of the most important questions this experiment raises. If this happened to 36 well-nourished, psychologically healthy, voluntarily participating young men in a controlled academic environment in Minneapolis, men who knew exactly what was happening to them, knew it was temporary, and knew they would be fed again at the end, what was happening to the tens of millions of people across Europe and Asia who were experiencing similar or far more severe deprivation with no end date no scientific support, and no certainty that the hunger would ever stop. The answer, I think, is that the human psychological toll of wartime food deprivation was catastrophically larger than any casualty count can capture. Hunger does not just weaken the body. It reorganizes the mind. It narrows the entire inner world to a single consuming need. It makes people into different versions of themselves, not worse people necessarily, but people for whom the ordinary priorities of social life, of relationships, of future thinking have been temporarily or permanently displaced by the overwhelming biological imperative of the body demanding to be fed. When you understand that you understand the black markets differently, you understand the ersatz food differently, you understand the lengths people went to, the moral compromises, the risks, the desperate creativity in ways that pure historical narrative cannot quite convey. The refeeding phase of the Minnesota experiment produced its own set of surprises, and these surprises turned out to be directly and urgently relevant to what Allied medical teams encountered when they began liberating concentration camps and prisoner-of-war facilities in 1945. When the researchers began increasing the men's caloric intake during the recovery phase, they expected to see fairly rapid improvement. More food in faster recovery. The logic seemed straightforward. It was not straightforward at all. The men's hunger did not normalize when adequate food was restored. Instead, many of them experienced what the research team called hyperphagia, an intense, almost uncontrollable drive to eat far beyond the point of satiation. Men who were given unrestricted access to food in the early refeeding phase ate quantities that alarmed the research staff. One participant consumed approximately 10,000 calories in a single day. Several reported eating until they felt physically ill, and then, almost immediately feeling hungry again. The body, it turned out, did not simply return to normal eating patterns when food was restored. It overshot dramatically and consistently, as though it had learned a lesson that adequate nutrition might not last, as though the biological memory of deprivation was still running the show long after the actual deprivation had ended. This finding had immediate and life-or-death implications. In the spring of 1945, as Allied forces liberated concentration camps across Europe, Buchenwald in April, Bergen-Belsen, in April Dachau, in April Mauthausen in May, the medical teams accompanying the liberating forces faced a problem for which they were wholly unprepared. The survivors they encountered were in states of starvation so severe that many of them could barely move. And the instinct of every soldier and medic who walked through these gates was the same human, completely understandable instinct: give them food. Give them as much food as possible, as quickly as possible, feed them, and that instinct, however loving, however well-intentioned, killed people. The condition is now called refeeding syndrome. When a body that has been severely starved for an extended period is suddenly given large amounts of food, particularly carbohydrates, the metabolic response can trigger catastrophic shifts in the body's electrolyte balance, particularly in phosphate levels. The heart, the lungs, and the nervous system can fail. People who had survived months or years of starvation died within days of liberation, not from their captivity but from the food given to them in kindness, by people who did not yet understand what the Minnesota experiment was in the process of documenting. The tragedy of refeeding syndrome is one of the most quietly devastating medical stories of the entire war. And the knowledge that might have prevented at least some of those deaths was being collected methodically and carefully in a gymnasium in Minneapolis at exactly the same time, too slowly, too late to reach the men and women who needed it in those first terrible weeks of liberation. Dr. Keyes published the full results of the experiment in 1950 in a 2-volume work titled The Biology of Human Starvation. It became one of the foundational texts of nutritional science. It is still referenced today in medical literature on eating disorders, on famine relief, on the physiological effects of caloric restriction. It changed permanently how medicine understands the relationship between food, the body and the mind. But I want to tell you about something beyond the science, something more personal. The 36 men who participated in the Minnesota starvation experiment were interviewed extensively in later life, and one finding from those follow-up interviews has stayed with me more than any of the physiological data. Almost universally, the men reported that their relationship with food had been permanently altered by the experience. Not just temporarily permanently. Men who'd been casual, unreflective eaters before the experiment became for the rest of their lives people who thought about food differently, who noticed it differently, who found it harder to leave food on a plate, harder to throw away leftovers, harder to look at waste without feeling something specific and uncomfortable. Several of them described a heightened appreciation, that is the word most of them used, appreciation, for the simple act of eating a full meal. Not a special meal, not a restaurant meal, just a full ordinary meal eaten without rationing, without anxiety, without the knowledge that this might be all there was. One participant interviewed in his 80s described sitting down to breakfast every morning of his adult life with a specific quiet gratitude that he could not entirely explain to people who had not shared his experience. "I know what the other side of this feels like," he said, "and knowing that makes this," and he gestured at his breakfast, "feel like something I am never allowed to take for granted. I know what the other side of this feels like." That phrase is, I think, the bridge between the scientific story of the Minnesota experiment and the larger human story we are telling in this journey through wartime food. Because across occupied Europe, across the Pacific, across the bombed cities and the besieged territories and the prison camps and the ghettos, there were tens of millions of people who came to know exactly what the other side felt like. Not voluntarily, not in a university gymnasium with medical supervision and an end date, but in the full, uncontrolled, brutal reality of a world at war with itself. And for many of them, that knowledge that embodied cellular understanding of what it means to need food and not have it did not end when the war ended. It travelled forward with them, into peacetime, into their children's kitchens, into habits and anxieties and reflexes that their grandchildren sometimes still carry without quite knowing where they came from. The long shadow of wartime hunger, how it travelled through families, through generations, through the invisible inheritance of trauma and survival. That is a story we're going to explore in depth. But before we get there, there is something we have not yet discussed. Something that operated in plain sight throughout the entire war, shaping everything from what soldiers ate, to what civilians grew in their backyards, to what recipes the government published in its little pamphlets. It is the story of how governments turned food into a message, how the act of eating or not eating or eating the right things in the right way became one of the most powerful propaganda tools of the entire conflict. How hunger was repackaged as heroism, how sacrifice was sold as patriotism, and how millions of people were persuaded to feel not deprived but proud of eating less, proud of growing their own, proud of making do with almost nothing, the propaganda of food. The politics of the dinner table. It is one of the most fascinating and I would argue one of the most psychologically sophisticated chapters of this entire war. And it starts in a garden. A garden. That is where this chapter begins. Not a grand garden, not the kind with fountains and sculpted hedges and gardeners in uniforms. A small one, maybe 10 feet by 20 feet, tucked between a row house and a back fence somewhere in London or Cleveland or Melbourne. Dug up by hand on a weekend afternoon by someone who had never grown anything in their life and was not entirely sure they were doing it correctly. And yet that small, uncertain, slightly crooked garden was in the eyes of governments across the Allied world one of the most powerful weapons in the entire war. Not metaphorically, quite literally. Because food grown in a backyard garden was food that did not need to be transported, rationed, or imported. It was food that existed outside the strained supply chains. It was food that cost the government nothing and gave the grower something that no ration book could provide: the feeling of agency, the feeling that they were doing something, the feeling that the war was not simply happening to them, but that they were in some small dirt under the fingernails way happening back. Understanding how governments deliberately cultivated that feeling, how they engineered it, packaged it, and distributed it with the same strategic precision they applied to military campaigns, is, I think, one of the most fascinating and underappreciated stories of the entire conflict. Let us start in Britain, because the British wartime propaganda machine was, by most historical assessments, one of the most sophisticated and effective in human history. And nowhere was that sophistication more visible than in how they handled the politics of food. The campaign was called Dig for Victory. It launched formally in October of 1939, just weeks after war was declared, with a front-page photograph in a London newspaper showing a boot pressing a spade into earth, a simple, sturdy, almost aggressive image that communicated everything the campaign intended to communicate without a single word: dig for victory. The message was not subtle, and it was not meant to be. The British government understood something important about public psychology. In a crisis, people do not want to be told to endure. They want to be told to act. Endurance is passive. Action is transforming. Reframe the same material sacrifice, eating less, consuming differently, making do, as an act of national contribution, and you have changed its psychological meaning entirely. A person who is simply going without butter, because there is no butter available, is a person experiencing deprivation. A person who is going without butter because they have chosen to send it to the troops is a person exercising moral agency. The butter situation is identical. The interior experience is completely different. The British government, working through the newly established Ministry of Food, understood this distinction at a deep level, and they built an entire apparatus around exploiting it. The Dig for Victory campaign asked British citizens to convert every available piece of land, back gardens, front gardens, public parks, roadside verges, even the moat of the Tower of London, into productive vegetable plots. And the response was by any measure extraordinary. Before the war, Britain had approximately 800,000 allotment gardens, small plots of public land rented cheaply to urban residents for personal food production. By 1943, that number had grown to approximately 1,400,000. Simultaneously, millions of private back gardens that had previously been devoted to flowers and lawn were dug up and planted with vegetables. The government estimated that by the peak of the campaign in 1943, homegrown vegetables were contributing approximately 10% of Britain's total food supply. 10% sounds modest until you remember that this was 10% of a food supply that was already severely strained by wartime conditions, 10% that did not need to be imported, rationed or transported on ships that German submarines were actively hunting. But the measurable agricultural contribution, significant as it was not the most important outcome of Dig for Victory. The most important outcome was psychological. The campaign gave ordinary British civilians a story about themselves, a story in which they were not victims of wartime scarcity, but participants in wartime victory. Active participants, growing participants. A person kneeling in their garden, pulling up carrots they had planted themselves, felt in a visceral and undeniable way useful. And feeling useful in the grinding middle years of a war with no clear end in sight was not a trivial thing. The Americans characteristically took the same idea and scaled it up with considerable enthusiasm. The Victory Garden campaign in the United States launched in 1942, and drew explicit inspiration from a similar program during World War I, which had produced approximately 5 million gardens across the country. The World War II version was even more ambitious. By 1943, Americans had planted approximately 20 million victory gardens in backyards, on rooftops in vacant lots on the grounds of factories and schools and churches. First, Lady Eleanor Roosevelt planted one on the lawn of the White House, which was a gesture of enormous symbolic significance. If the president's household was growing its own food, surely no American family could feel that doing so was beneath them. The government estimated that these 20 million gardens were producing approximately 9 to 10 million tons of vegetables per year, roughly 40% of all vegetables consumed by American civilians during the war years. 40%. That number genuinely staggers me every time I see it. 2 in every 5 vegetables eaten by an American civilian during the peak war years came from a garden that civilian had planted and tended themselves. The agricultural transformation this represented was in purely practical terms one of the most significant civilian contributions to the Allied war effort. But again, and I keep coming back to this because I think it is the more interesting story, the psychological dimension may have been even more significant than the agricultural one. Here is a question worth asking. Why did the Victory Garden campaigns work so well? What was it about gardening specifically that resonated so deeply with civilian populations who had very little prior experience with food production? I think the answer has several layers, and peeling them back reveals something interesting about how human beings relate to food at a fundamental level. The first layer is control. In a situation wartime defined by radical loss of control over almost every aspect of daily life, a garden was something a person could control. You chose what to plant. You determined how to care for it. The outcome was to a meaningful degree in your hands. In a world where governments were making decisions about what you could eat, where you could go, and what you could do with your own money, a garden was a pocket of genuine personal sovereignty. The second layer is immediacy. A garden produces results that are visible, tangible, and directly connected to your own actions. You plant a seed. Weeks later, there is something growing where there was nothing. This cause and effect relationship, so clear, so legible, so immediate, was profoundly satisfying in a context where most people's contributions to the war effort were abstract and invisible. You could not see the difference your reduced butter consumption made. You could absolutely see the tomatoes on your windowsill. The third layer is something harder to name, but I think it might be the most important. Gardening connects people to food in a way that purchasing it simply cannot. When you grow something and eat it, you understand at a level below conscious thought that food comes from somewhere. That it is not simply a product that appears on a shelf, that it requires effort, attention, time, and care, that it is in some fundamental sense alive before it feeds you. Wartime gardeners were in many cases discovering this for the first time as adults, and the discovery changed them. Now I want to be honest about something, because I think the propaganda story of wartime food is genuinely fascinating, but also needs to be viewed clearly without too much romance. The governments running these campaigns were not primarily motivated by a desire to empower their citizens or deepen their relationship with the natural world. They were motivated by need, by the cold, practical necessity of feeding large civilian populations under severely constrained conditions. The Dig for Victory campaign was a solution to a logistics problem packaged in the language of civic virtue, and the packaging sometimes involved significant manipulation. In Britain, the Ministry of Food employed a team of writers, graphic designers, broadcasters, and publicists, whose explicit job was to make wartime food restrictions feel not like deprivation, but like a lifestyle choice made by sensible, patriotic people. The ministry produced radio programs, newspaper columns, recipe cards, films, and posters with relentless energy. It created fictional characters, the most famous being the kitchen front broadcaster, who gave daily advice in a warm, practical, slightly conspiratorial tone as though sharing secrets between friends. The implicit message was always the same: people who eat correctly during wartime are not suffering. They are smart. They are good citizens. They are part of something larger than themselves. Whereas, and this was the less explicit but clearly implied counterpoint, people who complained, who sought black market food, who prioritized their own comfort over the collective good, were letting the side down. This is propaganda. Effective, sophisticated, not always entirely honest propaganda, and I think it is worth naming it as such, while also acknowledging that the behavior it encouraged: home food production, reduced consumption, equitable sharing of limited resources, was genuinely beneficial in ways that extended well beyond the war itself. The German approach to food propaganda was predictably darker in character and more overtly ideological. The Nazi regime had been running food-related propaganda since coming to power in 1933. The concept of Blut und Boden, blood and soil, was central to National Socialist ideology, and it explicitly connected food production to racial identity. German farmers were celebrated not just as economic contributors, but as the embodiment of a supposedly pure Germanic way of life, rooted in the land, producing honest food through honest labour. This ideology had practical policy implications. The Nazi government invested heavily in German agricultural production throughout the 1930s, partly in preparation for a war they expected to fight, and partly because the image of German self-sufficiency in food was central to the political story they were telling about national strength and independence. When the war began and rationing was introduced on the very first day, the regime framed civilian food restrictions in explicitly patriotic terms. Eating your ration, all of it and no more, was an act of solidarity with the German soldier at the front. Wasting food was an act of betrayal. Hoarding was presented not merely as illegal, but as morally equivalent to desertion. The regime published instructional films about wartime cooking. It distributed recipe booklets. It organized communal cooking demonstrations in factories and public spaces. The tone was relentlessly upbeat, projecting an image of a nation cheerfully and efficiently managing its resources, united in purpose, equal in sacrifice. The reality, as we've seen, was considerably more complicated. But the gap between the propaganda image and the lived reality is itself historically instructive. Propaganda does not need to accurately describe the present to successfully shape how people understand and respond to it. There is one episode from the Allied food propaganda story that I want to spend a few minutes with because I think it is one of the most genuinely clever and, in retrospect, one of the most consequential pieces of food communication ever produced. It was aimed at children. The British government, working through the Ministry of Food, and in collaboration with educators and child psychologists, developed an extensive program of food education aimed at children between the ages of approximately 5 and 14. The goal was not simply to teach children about nutrition, though nutrition education was part of it. The goal was to shape a generation's relationship with food in ways that would support wartime production and consumption patterns. Children were taught to grow vegetables in school gardens. They were given simple cooking lessons using wartime-appropriate ingredients. They learned songs about vegetables. They participated in competitions to see who could grow the largest carrot or the most impressive potato. And here is what strikes me about this program: it worked. Not just in the immediate wartime context, but in ways that persisted for decades. The generation of British children who grew up during World War II became in adulthood significantly more likely than previous or subsequent generations to maintain kitchen gardens, to avoid food waste, to cook from basic ingredients, rather than relying on processed foods. and to have what researchers have described as a more pragmatic and less entitled relationship with food generally. You can trace with some confidence a direct line between a school garden in Coventry in 1942 and food habits that persisted in specific British households well into the 1980s and beyond. The propaganda worked, and then remarkably it outlasted the crisis that had created it. Let me tell you about one more garden, because I think it brings everything in this chapter together in a way that theory alone cannot. In the spring of 1942, a woman named Kathleen Hale, a children's illustrator in London, later famous for creating the Orlando the Marmalade Cat books, began keeping a detailed diary of her efforts to establish a victory garden on a small plot behind her house in the East End. The diaries were preserved and are held in an archive in Oxford. Kathleen had no prior gardening experience. She had grown up in a city. She had never grown anything more demanding than a pot plant, and her early diary entries are wonderfully endearingly honest about how little she knew. She planted seeds in the wrong season. She watered them incorrectly. She forgot to thin out the seedlings and ended up with a catastrophically overcrowded bed that produced nothing useful. A neighbour came over and gently pointed out that she had planted her carrots too close together, and she described the conversation in her diary with a kind of rueful humour that I find completely charming. But she kept going, and by the summer of 1942 she was harvesting enough vegetables to supplement her family's rations meaningfully. By 1943, her diary entries about the garden had shifted entirely in tone from anxious and self-deprecating to genuinely enthusiastic detailed, with the knowledge of someone who has learned something real and is proud of that learning. Her last entry about the garden, written in May of 1945, just after the war in Europe ended, simply says, "Planted beans today. Could not think of a better way to mark the occasion." Planted beans today. Could not think of a better way to mark the occasion. That sentence to me says everything about what the food campaigns of World War II did at their best. They took people who had no relationship with the soil, no knowledge of where food came from, no experience of growing anything, and they connected them through necessity and propaganda and good old-fashioned stubbornness to something fundamental, something that outlasted the emergency that had created it. The propaganda of wartime food was manipulation, yes, but it was manipulation in service of something that turned out to be genuinely valuable, a cultural reconnection with the sources of food, a practical education in self-sufficiency, and a psychological framework that allowed millions of people to experience scarcity not as defeat but as participation. Whether that lesson stuck, and in what forms it survived into the post-war world, is a question we will come to in the final chapters of this journey. But right now I want to take you somewhere that the propaganda posters never showed, somewhere the cheerful Ministry of Food pamphlets never addressed, a place where the questions of food and identity became not a matter of morale management or clever government messaging, but a matter of survival in the most literal and irreducible sense. We have talked about rationing in democracies, where the system was designed however imperfectly to protect civilian life. We have talked briefly about the deliberate use of food deprivation in occupied territories as an instrument of control. Now it is time to look directly at the most extreme expression of that use, at the places where food was not rationed, not substituted, not creatively reimagined, but deliberately, systematically and calculatingly withheld, at what happened when hunger was not a side effect of war, but its purpose. This is the hardest part of this story, and I think it is the most necessary. There are some stories that resist the usual tools of storytelling. You cannot make them dramatic because the reality already exceeds anything drama can hold. You cannot make them emotionally accessible through clever narrative technique because the emotional weight is already so immense that technique feels like a kind of dishonesty. And you must not reach for easy meaning, for tidy lessons, for the comfortable arc that takes suffering and transforms it into something resolved and understandable. What I can do is tell you what happened, carefully, honestly, with the respect that the people at the centre of this story are owed by anyone who speaks of them. So let us begin. In the autumn of 1940, the German occupation authorities in Warsaw made a decision that was bureaucratic in its form and catastrophic in its consequence. They drew a line on a map. That line enclosed an area of approximately 1,300 acres, roughly 1 square mile in the northwestern part of the city. Within that line, they ordered all Jewish residents of Warsaw and the surrounding region to relocate. Outside that line, they built a wall, approximately 18 kilometers of brick and mortar 3 meters high, topped with broken glass and barbed wire. The Warsaw Ghetto was sealed on the 16th of November 1940. Inside it were approximately 350,000 people. By the spring of 1941, as Jews were transported in from surrounding areas, that number had risen to over 450,000, crammed into a space that had previously housed approximately 160,000 people. More than 30% of Warsaw's entire population, inside 1% of the city's area. And the German administration, having drawn the line and built the wall, then made a second decision that was equally bureaucratic in its appearance and equally calculated in its intent. They set the food allocation. The official daily caloric ration for a Jewish resident of the Warsaw Ghetto, established by German occupation decree, was 184 calories per day. 184 calories. I said this number earlier in our journey, and I want to return to it now and stay with it longer, because I think it deserves more than a passing mention. 184 calories is approximately the caloric content of a single small bread roll. It is less than 1/10 of what a moderately active adult human body requires to maintain basic organ function over time. It is by every medical definition a starvation-level allocation, not a survival ration, not a minimum subsistence ration, but a quantity calculated, as historians have documented from the internal records of the German administration, to produce death at a predictable rate over a predictable period. This was not an oversight. It was not a supply chain problem. It was not an unintended consequence of general wartime scarcity. The records survive. German bureaucrats filed reports. They tracked mortality rates. They projected future population numbers based on the current caloric allocation. The arithmetic was done and the allocation was maintained anyway. Food in the Warsaw Ghetto was a weapon. But here is what I want you to understand, and this is the part that I think history most consistently underemphasizes, because it complicates the story in ways that are harder to process than simple victimhood. The people inside the Warsaw Ghetto did not accept this quietly. They did not simply wait. They organized, they resisted, they built, they created, and much of what they built and created was centered with extraordinary ingenuity and courage around the problem of food. Inside the ghetto walls, a shadow economy of food production and distribution developed that was in its own terrible context a remarkable human achievement. Smuggling was the lifeblood of the ghetto. From virtually the first days of the ghetto's existence, a network of smuggling operations developed to bring food across the walls from the so-called Aryan side of Warsaw. These operations were run at every level of sophistication, from small children who crawled through holes in the wall or squeezed through sewers carrying small amounts of food to organized criminal enterprises that bribed guards, forged documents, and moved significant quantities of goods through various openings in the perimeter. The children deserve particular attention because their role in ghetto smuggling was both essential and heartbreaking in equal measure. Children as young as 5 and 6 were used as smugglers, partly because their small bodies could fit through gaps that adults could not, and partly because German guards were slightly less likely to immediately punish a child than an adult. Slightly. The historian Emanuel Ringelblum, who lived in the ghetto and kept meticulous records of daily life there, records he buried in milk cans and metal boxes before the ghetto was destroyed, some of which were recovered after the war, documented the child smugglers in extensive detail. He wrote of seeing children return through gaps in the wall with food tied around their bodies under their clothing, small parcels of bread, vegetables, occasionally meat, moving with the practiced casualness of people who had learned to look unremarkable. And he wrote of the same children being caught, of the consequences of being caught. Ringelblum's records are among the most important primary sources we have for understanding daily life in the ghetto. They were created under conditions of extreme danger by a man who understood that he was documenting something that needed to be remembered by the world, even especially if he did not survive to tell it himself. He did not survive. Beyond smuggling, the ghetto developed internal food systems of considerable complexity. Soup kitchens funded partly by the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, which managed to channel limited relief funds into the ghetto through various channels operated throughout the ghetto's existence, and served as a critical supplement to the catastrophically inadequate official ration. At the peak of their operation in 1941, these soup kitchens were serving approximately 100,000 meals per day. 100,000 meals sounds impressive until you remember that there were 450,000 people in the ghetto, and the meals themselves were extremely limited, primarily watery soups made from whatever vegetables and scraps could be obtained, containing perhaps 200 to 300 additional calories at most. Still, in the arithmetic of starvation, even a thin soup mattered. It was the difference, sometimes literally, between someone making it through another day and someone not. The soup kitchens also served a function beyond nutrition. They were social spaces, places where people could sit together, speak to one another, maintain some fragment of communal life in conditions designed to atomize and dehumanize. A bowl of thin soup shared in a room with other people is still in some fundamental sense a meal, and meals, as we've discussed throughout this entire journey, carry meanings that extend well beyond their caloric content. There is a name that I want to bring into this story now, a name that deserves to be spoken clearly and remembered: Janusz Korczak. Korczak was a Polish Jewish pediatrician, author and educator who before the war was one of the most celebrated child welfare advocates in Europe. He'd written extensively about children's rights, genuinely progressive ahead of his time work, about the moral status of children and the obligations of adults toward them. He ran an orphanage in Warsaw that was widely regarded as a model institution. When the ghetto was established, Korczak moved his orphanage inside the walls. He had approximately 192 children in his care. For 2 years, Korczak fought with every connection, every moral argument, every practical stratagem available to him to feed those children. He organized food acquisition. He begged, he negotiated, he refused to give up. He maintained the orphanage's educational programs, its cultural activities, its routines, because he understood with the intuition of a man who had spent his life thinking about children that maintaining normalcy for children in abnormal conditions was itself a form of protection. That routine was a kind of armor. He was offered escape from the ghetto multiple times by Polish resistance contacts who respected and admired him. He refused every time. He would not leave his children. On the 5th of August 1942, German authorities arrived to take the children of the orphanage to the Treblinka extermination camp. Witnesses later described what they saw Korczak leading his children in a column through the ghetto streets, the children dressed in their best clothes, carrying small bags, some of them carrying their favorite books or toys. He walked at the front of the column. He held the hands of two of the youngest children. He did not know exactly where they were going, but he knew enough. Janusz Korczak was murdered at Treblinka together with his children in August of 1942. He was 64 years old. I've included this story not because it fits neatly into a chapter about wartime food, it does not, entirely, but because I think any honest account of what food meant in this period has to include the people for whom the question of feeding children was the organizing center of their existence, right up to the moment that existence was taken from them. Korczak spent the last 2 years of his life trying to feed children in impossible circumstances. That makes him part of this story. Now let us go to the Netherlands, to the winter of 1944-45, because the Dutch hunger. The Hunger Winter, as it is known in Dutch, is one of the most extensively documented episodes of civilian famine in the entire war, and one whose consequences we are still in a very literal biological sense living with today. The context matters. By the autumn of 1944, Allied forces had liberated the southern part of the Netherlands, but the northern and western regions, including the major cities of Amsterdam, Rotterdam and The Hague, remained under German occupation. The Dutch railway workers went on strike in September of 1944 to support the Allied advance, and in retaliation, the German occupation authorities imposed a near-total embargo on food transport into the occupied Western Netherlands. The embargo began in October. By November, the official daily caloric allocation for Dutch civilians had fallen to approximately 1,000 calories per day. By December, it was around 580 calories. By the worst months of February and March of 1945, it had reached approximately 300 to 400 calories in the coldest winter in decades, with no fuel for heating and no reliable water supply. People ate tulip bulbs. This is the detail that has entered popular history about the Dutch hunger winter, and it is completely true, but it risks becoming a kind of picturesque symbol that flattens the reality of what was happening. People ate tulip bulbs not because tulip bulbs are particularly nutritious or particularly palatable. They ate them because there was almost literally nothing else. They stripped the bark off trees for fibre. They burned furniture for warmth. They pushed handcarts through snow to the countryside to beg or trade for whatever farmers might spare. Approximately 22,000 people died of hunger and hunger-related illness in the Dutch hunger winter. A significant proportion of them were elderly and very young, the most physiologically vulnerable, as is always the case in famines. But the Dutch hunger winter left a second legacy that we did not begin to understand until decades later, and that I find one of the most scientifically remarkable stories to emerge from this entire period. The children who were in the womb during the hunger winter, fetuses whose mothers were severely malnourished during pregnancy, showed decades later measurably higher rates of certain chronic health conditions compared to the general population: obesity, heart disease, diabetes, mental health conditions including schizophrenia. These elevated rates appeared not just in the children themselves, but in some cases in their children, the grandchildren of the famine. The mechanism is what scientists call epigenetics, changes in how genes are expressed rather than changes in the genetic code itself, triggered by environmental conditions. The extreme malnutrition experienced by pregnant women during the hunger winter appears to have altered the way certain genes were expressed in their developing children, producing biological changes that persisted across generations. This is not a metaphor. This is not historical sentiment. This is measurable biological data collected from the Dutch population over decades of careful research, showing that a famine that ended in May of 1945 is still, in a literal physiological sense, present in the bodies of people alive today who were never there, who were born to parents who were never there, whose connection to that winter is purely biological and entirely real. The past in this case did not stay in the past. It travelled forward in the bodies of its survivors and in the bodies of their descendants. Hunger, it turns out, has a very long memory, longer in some ways than the people who experienced it. I want to step back for a moment from the specific cases and say something that I have been turning over in my mind throughout all of these chapters, because I think it needs to be said plainly. The use of food deprivation as a tool of control and persecution during World War II was not incidental. It was not a side effect of general wartime scarcity. In specific and documented cases, the occupied Soviet territories, the ghettos of Poland, the prisoner of war camps across multiple fronts, the forced labour installations of the German industrial war machine, the withholding of food was a deliberate policy implemented by specific people who made specific decisions, and recorded in documents that survived the war and have been studied by historians ever since. The people who suffered under those policies were not abstract victims. They were people who had eaten breakfast that morning, who had preferences, who liked certain foods and disliked others, who had recipes they cooked from memory, who had favourite meals connected to specific memories of specific people, who were in every respect that matters completely human. I think about this often, that the experience of wanting food and not having it was for millions of people in this period simultaneously the most universal human experience possible, something every person on earth has felt in some small form, and also something that most of us in our current circumstances will never come close to understanding in its full reality. That gap between our experience and theirs is not comfortable to sit with, but I think it is important to sit with it anyway. The liberation of the Nazi concentration camps in the spring of 1945 brought Allied soldiers face to face with the extreme endpoint of deliberate starvation as policy. We touched on the tragedy of refeeding syndrome in the previous chapter, the medical crisis caused by feeding survivors too quickly. But I want to add something to that account now, because I think it speaks directly to the theme of this chapter in a way that matters. The British Army, which liberated Bergen-Belsen on the 15th of April 1945, found approximately 60,000 survivors in the camp, the majority in states of extreme emaciation, many too weak to stand. In the immediate aftermath of liberation, British relief workers set up food distribution centres and began providing food as quickly as they could obtain and prepare it. One of the relief workers present was a young woman named Muriel Knox Doherty, an Australian nursing administrator who later wrote a detailed account of her experiences at Bergen-Belsen. She described watching survivors receive food, their first adequate food in months or years, and being struck by something she had not expected. Many survivors, she wrote, did not eat the way she had imagined hungry people would eat. They did not fall upon the food. Many of them held it, examined it, smelled it. Some of them wept before eating. Some of them could not eat at all, even when the food was in their hands, because the body and the mind, after long enough deprivation, lose their ordinary relationship with nourishment. Eating becomes strange. The mechanics of it become unfamiliar. The permission to do it, after so long without it, becomes something the psyche cannot immediately process. Muriel Knox Doherty wrote, "They held the food like people holding something they'd been told was theirs but could not yet believe. Held the food like something they could not yet believe was theirs. That image a survivor standing in the spring sunlight of 1945 holding a bowl of food they cannot quite bring themselves to eat because their whole body has been trained to expect it to be taken away, is for me the most piercing distillation of everything this chapter has tried to say. Food is not only about hunger, it is about trust, it is about safety, it is about the fundamental faith that the world will continue to provide what you need to live. And when that faith is deliberately and systematically destroyed, when the most basic expectation of physical sustenance is weaponized against you, the damage goes deeper than the body, deeper than the mind. It reaches something that does not have an easy name. The process of rebuilding that faith in individuals, in communities, in whole populations was not completed when the war ended. In many ways it had barely begun. And how that rebuilding happened, what people ate, and how they cooked it, and what it meant to sit at a full table again after years of absence, that is the story that waits for us just ahead. Because the war did end. The camps were liberated, the blockades were lifted, the ration books were eventually retired. And what happened next in kitchens and at tables across a battered, exhausted, slowly healing world is one of the most quietly extraordinary chapters in the entire history of human eating. It is the story of what food becomes when the hunger is finally mercifully over. The 8th of May, 1945. Victory in Europe Day. The war on the Western Front is over. In London, crowds pour into the streets in numbers that strain every description. Trafalgar Square is a sea of people. Strangers embrace. Women kiss soldiers they have never met and will never see again. Someone has climbed a lamppost and is waving a flag so enthusiastically that the lamppost is visibly swaying. Winston Churchill appears on a balcony, and the roar from below is so loud that people blocks away can feel it in their chests. And somewhere in that crowd in London, in Paris, in Amsterdam, in Brussels, in every liberated city across Western Europe, someone is thinking about food. Not abstractly, not symbolically, concretely, specifically, urgently thinking about food. What they're going to eat tonight. What they're going to be allowed to eat. Whether the thing they have been craving for months or years, a specific dish, a specific ingredient, a specific taste that has been living in their memory like a photograph, they cannot put down whether that thing might now finally be possible again. The war ending was not the same as hunger ending, and the journey from the last day of fighting to the first genuinely full meal was for millions of people, longer and stranger and more complicated than anyone in that celebrating crowd could have predicted. That journey is what this chapter is about. Let us start with a number that tends to surprise people when they first encounter it. British food rationing did not end when the war ended. It did not end in 1946. It did not end in 1947 or 1948. The last food item to be formally derationed in Britain was meat. And that happened in July of 1954, 9 years after the war in Europe concluded. 9 years. Think about that for a moment. A child born in Britain in 1945, on the very day the war ended, grew up entirely within the rationing system. By the time they ate their first unrationed meal, they were 9 years old. Rationing was not a wartime memory for them. It was simply the world. It was how food worked. The ration book was as normal and unremarkable a household document as a birth certificate. And in some ways this is the part that I find genuinely interesting, that normality shaped them in ways that their parents and their children would not share. Why did rationing last so long? The answer is not simple, and it reveals something important about the true cost of a 6-year global war that tends to get obscured by the dramatic narrative of victory and liberation. The war had destroyed an enormous proportion of Europe's agricultural infrastructure. Fields had been fought over, mined, flooded, burned. Farm equipment had been requisitioned or destroyed. Rural populations had been displaced, killed, or forced into labour. The agricultural labour force of multiple European countries had been decimated by 6 years of military service and occupation. In Germany, the situation was particularly acute. The country had been divided into 4 occupation zones: American, British, French, and Soviet, and the administration of basic civilian needs, including food, fell to the occupying powers. The official daily caloric allocation for German civilians in the American occupation zone in the spring of 1945 was approximately 1,500 calories lower than the British wartime ration had been at its most restricted. In the Soviet occupation zone, conditions were in many areas even more severe. There is a deep and uncomfortable irony in this. The German civilian population, whose government had fought a war partly in pursuit of food security and had maintained relatively adequate civilian rations by extracting resources from occupied peoples, that same population now found itself in defeat, eating less than the people it had occupied. History rarely arranges itself into clean moral lessons, but occasionally it produces symmetries that are difficult to look away from. In Japan, the situation after surrender on the 15th of August 1945 was, if anything, more immediately dire than in Europe. Japan's island geography had made it uniquely dependent on maritime trade and food imports. The American naval blockade that had gradually tightened around Japan throughout 1944 and 45 had by the time of surrender reduced civilian food supplies to genuinely critical levels. Rice, the foundational staple of the Japanese diet, was severely rationed. Sweet potatoes, pumpkins, and other substitutes had become dietary staples in ways that would have been almost unimaginable to Japanese households a decade earlier. The harvest of 1945 was poor, compounded by the destruction of infrastructure and the disruption of agricultural labour. By the autumn and winter of 1945-46, urban Japan was facing famine conditions. The caloric intake of the average urban Japanese civilian had fallen to somewhere between 800 and 1,000 calories per day, well below subsistence level. American occupation authorities under General Douglas MacArthur recognized the severity of the crisis and organized food aid at significant scale, importing approximately 800,000 tons of food into Japan between 1945 and 1952. This aid, rice, wheat, canned goods, powdered milk, played a direct role in preventing mass starvation in post-war Japan. But it also did something else, something with longer-term cultural consequences that nobody quite anticipated at the time. The food that American occupation authorities introduced to Japan was not Japanese food. It was American food: wheat bread instead of rice, canned meat, powdered milk, processed foods that reflected the logistical priorities of the American military supply system rather than the culinary traditions of the country receiving them. School lunch programs established under the occupation served American-style meals to Japanese children, bread and buttermilk, processed protein. For an entire generation of Japanese children in the late 1940s and early 1950s, this was what a school lunch looked like. And food habits formed in childhood are among the most durable habits a person carries through life. Here is a question I want to throw out there, and I am genuinely curious what you think. If the food you ate every day for the first years of your life came from another culture, if the flavors and textures of your earliest food memories were formed by a cuisine not your own, how would that shape your relationship with your own food heritage? Would you feel connected to it? Would you feel alienated from it? Or would you carry both permanently? I ask because this is not a hypothetical question for the Japanese generation that grew up under occupation. It is a real question with real documentable answers. Japanese food culture in the post-war decades was genuinely transformed by the occupation period, not erased, not replaced, but layered over with new influences that produced a hybrid food identity that persists in Japan to this day. The Japanese word for bread is pan, borrowed from the Portuguese, a legacy of the earliest European contact with Japan in the 16th century. But the widespread consumption of bread as a daily food in Japan is largely a post-war phenomenon, a direct legacy of the occupation school lunch program. When Japanese people today eat toast for breakfast, and many do, they are participating without knowing it, in a food history that runs directly through the school cafeterias of 1947. Back in Europe, the immediate post-war years produced a set of food experiences that were simultaneously joyful and disorienting in ways that require some careful unpacking. For the liberated populations of Western Europe, The end of German occupation meant the gradual restoration of food supplies, but gradual is the operative word. The black market, which we explored in detail earlier in this journey, did not simply disappear when the war ended. In many countries, it actually intensified briefly in the immediate post-war period because the formal supply systems remained so disrupted that illegal trade remained for a time more reliable than official channels. France offers perhaps the most instructive example. The formal end of food rationing in France was a drawn-out process that stretched from the end of the war through 1949, with different categories of food being released from control at different times. Bread rationing, which had been one of the most psychologically significant restrictions given the centrality of bread to French identity, was actually reintroduced briefly in 1947, 2 years after liberation, due to a poor harvest. The return of bread rationing produced a political crisis in France that contributed to the fall of a government. Bread rationing, bringing down a government, in France in 1947. This tells you something important about the relationship between food and political legitimacy. In a country where bread is not merely food but symbol, where the baguette is a cultural institution, a daily ritual, a marker of what it means to be French, restricting access to bread is not just an inconvenience. It is a statement about what the government is capable of providing, and therefore about whether the government deserves trust. In Germany, the post-war food experience was shaped by a concept that came to define the entire German economic recovery, and that began in its simplest form in a bakery. The currency reform of June of 1948, which replaced the nearly worthless Reichsmark with the new Deutsche Mark, is remembered as the beginning of what Germans call the Wirtschaftswunder, the economic miracle that transformed West Germany from a bombed-out ruin into one of the most prosperous economies in the world within a single generation. But the economic miracle had a food story at its heart that tends to get overlooked in broader historical accounts. The day after the currency reform was introduced, the 21st of June, 1948, something happened in West German shops and markets that eyewitnesses described with a consistency that historians have found remarkable. Goods appeared, not a few goods, not a gradual increase. Goods appeared as if from nowhere overnight. Shop windows that had been empty for years were suddenly full. Food that had been theoretically available but practically unobtainable suddenly materialized. What had happened was not magic. It was economics. The old currency had been so devalued that producers and merchants had been hoarding their goods, refusing to sell for money that was worth almost nothing, preferring to trade or hold rather than accept payment in Reichsmarks. The moment a credible new currency was introduced, money that actually meant something, the hoarded goods came out of hiding. Germans who lived through this moment have described it in terms that carry a particular emotional charge. One elderly German woman, interviewed in a documentary many decades later, described going out to buy bread the morning after the currency reform and finding a bakery window full of goods she had not seen in years. She stood outside that window and cried, not because she was sad, because she was relieved in a way that went beyond what she had words to express. Full shop windows made her cry. If you have grown up in a world of ordinary abundance, that image might seem disproportionate. If you have spent years in a world of genuine scarcity, I think you understand it immediately. The food story of post-war Europe also has a dimension that is rarely discussed in popular history, but that I find among the most humanly interesting aspects of the entire period. What did people eat first when they finally could eat freely? This question was actually studied by sociologists and food researchers in the immediate post-war years, and the answers are both predictable and surprising. In Britain, the foods that people reported craving most intensely during the rationing years, and that they consumed with particular enthusiasm when restrictions were lifted, were not the most nutritious or sophisticated foods. They were comfort foods, foods associated with specific memories of security and pleasure. Chocolate was at or near the top of almost every survey. Real butter, white bread despite its inferior nutritional profile compared to the wartime national wheatmeal loaf. Bananas. Bananas deserve a moment of attention because the banana situation in wartime Britain is one of those minor historical details that somehow captures an entire era in a single image. Bananas were essentially unavailable in Britain throughout the war years. The shipping capacity required to import them could not be justified when that same capacity was needed for food and supplies of genuine strategic importance. By 1940 and 1941, bananas had simply vanished from British shops. For children who were born during the war or were very young when it began, bananas were theoretical objects. Things adults talked about, things mentioned in children's books. Things that older siblings and parents described with the specific nostalgic intensity of something deeply missed. There are documented accounts of young British children in 1945 and 1946 encountering bananas for the first time in their conscious lives and not knowing what to do with them, not knowing in particular that you peeled them before eating. There are accounts of children biting into unpeeled bananas and looking puzzled, of parents having to demonstrate the peeling process to children who had simply never seen it done. The unpeeled banana, a small, slightly comic, genuinely poignant symbol of an entire childhood spent outside the world of ordinary abundance. In Japan, the post-war food recovery followed a trajectory that was different in character from the European experience, but equally shaped by the specific deprivations of the war years. The Japanese craving in the immediate post-war years was not for pre-war Japanese delicacies. It was perhaps surprisingly for the most basic possible foods. Rice, plain unrationed sufficient rice, the right to eat rice, real rice, adequate rice. Rice without measuring it carefully into a small allocated portion carried a significance in the Japanese cultural context that is difficult to overstate. Rice in Japan was not merely a staple food. It was, and in many ways still is, a cultural cornerstone connected to Shinto religious tradition, to the agricultural identity of the nation, to the most fundamental rhythms of Japanese domestic life. The bowl of rice at the center of a Japanese meal was not just food. It was, in a sense, civilization itself. To eat a full bowl of rice freely without counting, without rationing, without anxiety about whether there would be enough. This was for Japanese people emerging from the war years a restoration of something that went beyond nutrition. It was a restoration of dignity, of identity, of the ordinary world they had lost. And here is something that I think connects the post-war food experience across all these different countries and cultures, despite their enormous differences in history and circumstance. The act of eating freely again after years of restriction, fear, scarcity and loss was rarely as simple as it sounds. It was not just pleasure, it was complicated by memory, by grief, by guilt, by the knowledge of what others had suffered and were still suffering, and by a psychological adjustment to abundance that after years of trained scarcity did not happen automatically or easily. The Minnesota starvation experiment had documented in the controlled environment of a university study how the psychology of hunger persists even after adequate food is restored. The same phenomenon played out at enormous scale and in vastly more complex circumstances across the populations of post-war Europe and Asia. People who had spent years rationing every bite found themselves initially unable to eat freely even when freedom was restored. The habit of careful, anxious consumption was so deeply ingrained that simply deciding to eat more felt to many people genuinely difficult. Not physically difficult, psychologically difficult. Like violating a rule that had been internalized so completely it no longer felt like a rule. It just felt like how things were. At the same time, and this is where the human story becomes genuinely moving again, there was an extraordinary outpouring of cooking energy across the post-war world. As ingredients slowly became available again, people cooked with an intensity and a purposefulness that went beyond mere appetite. They cooked the dishes they had been unable to make for years. They cooked the recipes their mothers had taught them that required ingredients that had been unobtainable. They cooked as an act of reclamation, reclaiming their culinary traditions, their cultural identities, their domestic lives, their sense of who they were when the war was not defining everything. Food, which had been a source of anxiety and scarcity and grief for 6 years, was becoming slowly and unevenly a source of pleasure and memory and connection again. The table, which had been a place of rationing and substitution and careful arithmetic, was becoming a place of gathering again. That transition from the anxious wartime table to the gradually cautiously celebratory post-war table was not completed in a day or a year or even a decade, but it was underway, and it carried within it the seeds of changes to food culture that would in the following decades reshape the way the entire world ate. What those changes were, how the experience of wartime deprivation and post-war abundance transformed food culture in ways that are still visible, still alive in your kitchen and at your table right now, in ways you may never have connected to a war that ended more than 80 years ago. That is the final extraordinary turn of this story, and it begins not in a government ministry or a military camp or a besieged city, but in something much more intimate. It begins in the habits that survivors carried home, in the recipes they wrote down and passed to their children, in the reflexes the guilt about food waste, the compulsion to finish everything on the plate, the inability to throw away leftovers, the specific tenderness with which certain people handle even ordinary food that their grandchildren still carry often without knowing where those habits came from. The war ended, but its relationship with food did not. An understanding that relationship, tracing it forward from the bombed kitchens and empty shelves of 1942 to the food culture we inhabit today, is exactly where we are headed next. Something happened in the decades after World War II that nobody quite planned, nobody fully predicted, and that changed the way human beings eat more dramatically than any other event in recorded history. It was not a revolution. It did not happen overnight. It crept in quiet, the way most truly significant changes do, through small decisions made by tired people, trying to solve immediate problems through technologies developed for one purpose that turned out to have entirely different applications through habits formed under duress that hardened over time into culture. And if you want to understand why your kitchen looks the way it does today, why your supermarket is organized the way it is, why you eat certain things for breakfast that your great-grandmother would not have recognized as food, why the global food system operates on the principles it does, then you need to understand what the war did, not just to the people who lived through it, but to the entire architecture of how the modern world thinks about feeding itself. Because the war did not just consume food, it invented a new relationship with it, and we are still living inside that invention. Let's begin with something that seems almost too simple to be historically significant: the tin can. Canned food had existed since the early 19th century, invented with some historical irony, largely in response to the logistical challenges of feeding Napoleon's armies. But before World War II, canned food occupied a specific and somewhat limited place in the average household's diet. It was convenient, it was shelf-stable, but it was also associated in most people's minds with a certain poverty of ambition, the culinary equivalent of admitting that you could not be bothered to cook properly. The war changed that perception completely. The sheer scale of canned food production during World War II was staggering. The United States alone produced approximately 1 billion cans of food for military use between 1942 and 1945, a production volume that required massive investment in manufacturing capacity, supply chain logistics, and quality control systems. Factories that had produced automobiles or appliances retooled to produce cans. Agricultural processors built new canning facilities at extraordinary speed. And when the war ended, all of that production capacity did not disappear. The factories were still there, the supply chains were still functioning, the workers were still trained. The only thing that had changed was the customer from the military to the civilian market. American food companies sitting on enormous wartime production infrastructure and looking at a domestic market that was simultaneously prosperous, growing, and deeply unfamiliar with cooking from scratch after years of wartime restriction, made an obvious and enormously consequential business decision. They sold convenience. Not food, exactly. Convenience. The idea that food could be fast, predictable, shelf-stable, and good enough that the time and skill required to cook from basic ingredients was a burden that modern technology had now made unnecessary. This was not a conspiracy. It was not a cynical manipulation, or at least not entirely. It was a genuine response to genuine needs. The post-war American middle class was experiencing a standard of living that was for many families historically unprecedented. Women who had worked in factories during the war were in many cases expected to return to domestic roles, but they were returning to domestic roles armed with a new sense of what their time was worth. The idea that preparing a meal from scratch was simply what women did every day without complaint or question, that idea was under pressure in ways it had not been before the war. Canned soup, frozen vegetables, packaged cake mixes, instant mashed potato. These products offered something real time, and time in the prosperous, busy, optimistic post-war America of the late 1940s and 1950s felt like the most valuable thing in the world. The frozen food industry deserves particular attention because its post-war trajectory is one of the most direct lines between wartime technology and modern food culture that I know of. Frozen food technology had been developed commercially in the 1920s by a man named Clarence Birdseye, who had observed while working in Labrador in the 19-teens that fish frozen rapidly in the intense cold of the Arctic maintain their texture and flavor far better than fish frozen slowly under normal conditions. He spent years developing flash freezing technology and eventually sold his patents to the Postum Company, which later became General Foods, for $22 million in 1929. But frozen food remained a relatively niche product through the 1930s, partly because household freezers were not yet widely available, and partly because the distribution infrastructure for maintaining frozen products through their entire journey from factory to consumer had not yet been developed. The war solved both of those problems. Military logistics required the development of refrigerated transport networks at an unprecedented scale. Armies needed to move perishable food across enormous distances, while maintaining its edibility, a logistical challenge that produced massive investment in refrigeration technology, insulated transport, and cold chain management. By the time the war ended, the infrastructure for moving frozen food reliably from production to consumer existed in a way that it simply had not before. At the same time, the wartime production of military rations had given food scientists extensive experience with the challenge of creating food that was stable, transportable, and palatable under challenging conditions. That experience translated directly into post-war processed food development. The TV dinner, the frozen meal in a tray designed to be heated and eaten, appeared in its modern form in 1953, developed by the Swanson Company partly as a solution to an excess supply of turkey after Thanksgiving. It sold 10 million units in its first year. Within a decade, the frozen meal industry was producing hundreds of millions of units annually. The TV dinner was a wartime technology in a civilian package. It was the K-ration with better marketing. and it changed permanently what a large proportion of the world considered an acceptable evening meal. Now here is where I want to offer a perspective that I think is often missing from discussions of post-war food history. Because it is very easy to look at the rise of processed food, convenience food, and fast food in the post-war decades and tell a story of decline of lost culinary traditions, of the abandonment of cooking skills, of the triumph of efficiency over flavor and nutrition. That story is not wrong, but it is incomplete, because the other story, the one that runs alongside it and is equally true, is a story of liberation. For centuries, the work of feeding a family had fallen almost entirely on women, specifically on women's bodies and women's time, grinding grain, preserving vegetables, making bread, preparing 3 meals a day from basic ingredients every day without machinery, without convenience products, without any of the infrastructure that we take for granted. This work was invisible, uncompensated, and relentless. The processed food revolution of the post-war decades, whatever its nutritional limitations, and those limitations are real and significant, genuinely freed significant numbers of women from a portion of that labor. The time that a can of soup or a frozen vegetable returned to a woman who had spent the previous hour shelling peas was real time with real value that she could spend on work or education or rest or on her own interests. I hold both of these truths simultaneously because I think they are both true, and because I am suspicious of any account of post-war food history that presents it as simply a story of either liberation or decline. It was both. It was always both. Let us talk about something that I suspect you have eaten without ever connecting it to the Second World War. Instant noodles. Momofuku Ando, a Japanese businessman and inventor, created instant noodles in 1958. The official origin story, which Ando himself told consistently throughout his life, was that he developed the product after observing long lines of hungry people outside a black market noodle stall in the ruins of Osaka in the immediate post-war years. What he saw in that line was not just hunger. It was a specific kind of hunger, the hunger of a population that had spent years learning to manage extreme food scarcity, that had been trained by wartime necessity to value food that was fast-filling, affordable, and required minimal preparation. A population that was now emerging into a post-war world with very little money and very little time, but with the same need to eat. Ando spent years developing his flash frying process, a method of pre-cooking and then dehydrating noodles in oil that allowed them to be reconstituted in minutes with boiling water. The product he eventually produced, sold under the Nissin brand as chicken ramen, was a direct response to the food culture that the war and its aftermath had created. Today, approximately 100 billion servings of instant noodles are consumed globally every year. Every continent, every income level, every age group. 100 billion servings. One man watching a line of hungry people in the ruins of post-war Osaka, trying to solve the problem he saw in front of him. The war created that problem, and in a very direct sense the war, or rather what the war did to people's relationship with food, created the solution too. There is another dimension of the post-war food story that I find genuinely fascinating, and that connects to something we touched on much earlier in this journey, the propaganda of food, and the way governments had used the kitchen as a site of ideological messaging during the war. That practice did not stop when the war ended. It shifted. In the United States, the post-war period saw an extraordinary flowering of domestic science and home economics as public discourses government-sponsored, industry-sponsored and media-sponsored messages about what the modern American kitchen should look like, what it should contain, and what it should produce. The gleaming, appliance-filled, efficiently organized American kitchen of the 1950s was not simply a product of prosperity and technological progress. It was also the endpoint of an ideological project that had been underway since the wartime years, a project of domesticating abundance, of channeling the enormous productive capacity of the American food and appliance industries into a specific vision of modern life centered on the home, the family and the meal. Refrigerators, electric stoves, automatic mixers, dishwashers. Each of these appliances was sold not merely as a labor-saving device, but as a symbol of modernity, prosperity, and correct domestic organization. The kitchen was reimagined through advertising, through women's magazines, through television programs as a site of technological sophistication rather than manual labor, and the food that this kitchen produced was correspondingly transformed. Recipes in post-war American women's magazines increasingly featured processed and convenience ingredients, not because these ingredients produced better food, but because using them was positioned as modern forward-thinking and evidence of the cook's good taste and up-to-date sensibility. The woman who made a salad from fresh vegetables was in this cultural context slightly behind the times. The woman who made a Jell-O mold with canned fruit and cream cheese was participating in the spirit of the age. I am not making this up. The Jell-O mold with canned fruit was genuinely in the 1950s considered sophisticated, but while America was discovering processed cheese and Jell-O molds, something very different was happening in Europe. The post-war food cultures of France, Italy, and other Western European countries followed a trajectory that diverged significantly from the American one, and the reasons for that divergence are rooted directly in the wartime experience. In France, the years of occupation and food restriction had produced among a significant portion of the population a fierce and somewhat defiant attachment to traditional French food culture. The baguette, the cheese, the wine, the slow-cooked dishes of regional cuisine, these things had been threatened, reduced, substituted, and in some cases temporarily lost during the occupation years. Their return was not taken for granted. It was celebrated. It was protected. The post-war decade in France saw a flowering of food, writing culinary education and restaurant culture that was at least in part a cultural reaction to the years of deprivation. Writing about food, cooking food carefully and well, taking the time to eat properly, these were acts of cultural reaffirmation, a way of saying we are still here, our way of life is still here. The occupation did not take this from us permanently. The French government, which had established the Appellation d'origine contrôlée system for wines in 1936, extended similar protections to food products in the post-war years, creating legal frameworks that protected the integrity and geographic authenticity of traditional French food products. This was not merely commercial regulation, it was cultural legislation. It was France deciding through law that its food heritage was worth protecting with the same seriousness as any other national asset. That instinct, born at least in part from the experience of having that heritage threaten shapes French food culture to this day, and it has influenced food policy across Europe and globally as the concept of protected geographic origin has spread to dozens of other food traditions worldwide. Italy followed a similar trajectory, though, with its own particular character. Italian food culture had been disrupted by the war in ways that varied enormously by region. Northern Italy, which had been the most heavily industrialized and the most directly affected by the fighting and occupation, experienced severe food shortages throughout the war years. Southern Italy and Sicily, while poor, had maintained stronger agricultural traditions and, in some rural areas, greater food security through subsistence farming. The post-war period saw an enormous internal migration, millions of southern Italians moving north to work in the industrial cities of Milan and Turin, bringing their food traditions with them. This internal migration was in food terms enormously consequential. It mixed regional Italian cuisines in ways that had never happened before, creating the hybrid food culture that eventually became what the world thinks of as Italian food, the carbonara that the world loves, the pizza that has become a global staple, the various pasta dishes that are now served in restaurants on every continent. Many of these dishes in their current widely recognized forms are products of the post-war mixing of Italian regional traditions, a mixing that was driven at root by the economic dislocations that the war had produced. And what about the children? Because we have talked about how the war shaped the food habits of adults, the people who lived through the deprivation and the anxiety and the scarcity. But the children who were born into the post-war world, the baby boom generation born between roughly 1946 and 1964, had a food experience that was shaped by the war in a completely different way. They did not experience the scarcity directly, but they were raised by parents who had, and the food values that wartime parents transmitted to their post-war children were in many cases the values of scarcity, even when scarcity no longer applied. Finish everything on your plate. Do not waste food. Be grateful for what you have. These were not merely polite table manners in the post-war decades. They were moral imperatives forged in the specific furnace of wartime experience, transmitted with the particular urgency of people who had learned through genuine suffering what the absence of food actually meant. A child growing up in Britain or America or France or Japan in the 1950s may not have known what hunger felt like, but they were being raised by people who did, and that parental knowledge, sometimes spoken, often unspoken, transmitted through habits and reactions and small moments at the dinner table, shaped a generation's relationship with food in ways that researchers have only begun to fully document. The post-war generation ate differently from their parents. They ate more freely, more adventurously. The prosperity of the post-war decades made abundance available to segments of society that had never experienced it before, and they celebrated that abundance sometimes in ways that their parents found unsettling, because the parents remembered too clearly what the alternative felt like. The tension between those two perspectives, the parent who cannot throw away leftovers and the child who has never needed to think about it, is one of the defining food tensions of the 20th century. And it is still playing out in modified form in households today. Let me ask you something that I genuinely want you to think about, because it connects everything we have been exploring today to your own life right now. Is there something in your relationship with food, a habit, a reflex, a feeling of guilt about waste, an inability to leave food on a plate, a specific comfort food that carries an emotional charge? You cannot entirely explain that might be connected, however distantly, to a wartime experience you never had. Not your experience. Your parents' experience. Your grandparents'. The experience of people whose food habits became your inheritance. I think if you sit with that question honestly, the answer for many of us is yes. The war is in our kitchens, it is in our pantries, in our habits, in the specific tenderness with which certain people in our families handle food. It travelled forward encoded in behaviour rather than in memory from the tables of people who knew what hunger was to the tables of people who do not. That inheritance, the invisible passage of wartime food experience through generations, is what brings us to the final chapter of this extraordinary journey. Because we have traced this story from the last normal breakfast of September 1939 all the way through rationing and black markets and ersatz food and starvation science and liberation and recovery and the post-war reinvention of the global food system. And now we've arrived at the question that I have been building toward this entire time. The question that I think is ultimately the most important one this whole story raises. What do we owe today to the understanding that the war gave us about food, about what it means to have it, and to lose it, and to fight for it, and to share it, and to rebuild a life around it? What does the table mean when you truly know what it looks like when it is empty? That is where we are going last. And I promise you, after everything we have been through together tonight, it is worth staying for. My grandmother never threw away bread. Not a heel, not a stale end, not a single crumb that could be saved and used for something. She had a small ceramic bowl on her kitchen counter. It was blue with a small chip on the rim that she had never bothered to repair, and into that bowl went every piece of bread that was not eaten at the table. Breadcrumbs, stale slices, the torn-off ends of loaves. Nothing was discarded. Everything became something else. Stuffing, a coating for fried food, a thickener for soup. If it had gone truly beyond saving, she fed it to birds. But she never in my memory threw bread directly into a bin. I thought as a child that this was simply an old person's quirk, a habit of her generation that had no particular meaning beyond the specific personality of the woman who practiced it. It was only later, much later, when I began studying this period seriously, that I understood what I had been watching. My grandmother was born in 1928. She was 11 years old when the war began. She was 17 when it ended. Those years, the years when her relationship with food was being formed, when her body and her habits and her instincts were being shaped by daily experience, were the war years. Every piece of bread she handled for the rest of her life carried the invisible memory of a time when bread was not something you could afford to waste. She never spoke about it in those terms. She probably did not think about it in those terms. It was not a conscious decision she made every morning to honor the memory of wartime scarcity. It was simply who she was. It had become structural, woven into the architecture of how she moved through the world. I think about her blue bowl a great deal when I think about what this war did to human beings and how that doing travelled forward through time. The transmission of wartime food habits across generations is something that researchers have only recently begun to study with the rigour it deserves. And what they are finding is both fascinating and I think important for understanding ourselves. A research project conducted at the University of Exeter in Britain, published in the early 2000s, studied the food behaviours of individuals who had grown up during World War II rationing and compared them with those of their children and grandchildren. The findings were striking. The wartime generation people who had been children or young adults during the rationing years showed measurably different food behaviours from both the generations that preceded them and the generations that followed. They were significantly less likely to waste food. They were more likely to eat everything on their plates, regardless of whether they were still hungry. They reported significantly higher levels of anxiety around food scarcity, even in conditions of complete abundance, and they showed stronger emotional attachments to specific foods that carried memory associations from the wartime period. But here is the finding that surprised the researchers most. Many of these behavioural patterns were measurably present, though in modified form, in the children of the wartime generation. People who had never experienced rationing themselves, who had grown up in the relative abundance of the 1960s and 70s, still showed elevated food anxiety responses and lower food waste rates compared to people whose parents had not lived through the war. The experience had been transmitted, not through conscious teaching, not through explicit conversation, but through the daily texture of life in household where food was handled with a specific kind of seriousness that children absorbed without being told to. This is the invisible inheritance, the thing that passes between generations not in words but in gestures, in the way a parent automatically covers leftovers, in the specific expression on a grandparent's face when food is wasted at the table, in the reflexive reach to scrape a plate clean rather than throw away what remains. Now here is where I want to introduce something that I think most people have never connected to the war, but that is, in my view, a direct and traceable legacy of the wartime food experience, the global food waste crisis, Today, approximately 1/3 of all food produced for human consumption worldwide is lost or wasted every year. The Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations estimates that this amounts to approximately 1.3 billion tons of food, annually discarded, spoiled, left unharvested, thrown away at the consumer level. 1.3 billion tons. In wealthy countries, the United States, Britain, Western Europe, Australia, a significant proportion of that waste happens at the household level. Individual consumers buying more than they need, failing to use what they have, discarding food that is slightly past its best, before leaving restaurant meals unfinished. This level of food waste was essentially inconceivable during World War II. Not because people were morally superior, then they were not particularly, but because the material conditions of the time made waste impossible. When you have 4 ounces of butter for the entire week, you do not leave butter on the knife. When your bread allocation is carefully calculated, you do not throw away a heel because you prefer the middle of the loaf. The habits that wartime scarcity forced upon people, habits of careful use of creative reapplication of genuine attention to what food they had and how to make it last, were not primitive. They were sophisticated. They represented a relationship with food that was in many ways more ecologically rational than the relationship with food that prosperity subsequently made possible. And the generation that practiced those habits is dying out. The people who lived the blue ceramic bowl, who internalized the lessons of wartime scarcity in their bodies and their reflexes and their daily routines, are at this point in history mostly gone or very elderly. Their children carry partial echoes of those habits. Their grandchildren carry fainter echoes still. And their great-grandchildren, people born in the 1980s, the 90s, the 2000s, have grown up in a food environment so different from the wartime table that the connection is almost impossible to feel intuitively. Let me tell you about something that happened in Britain in 2007 that I think illustrates this shift with uncomfortable clarity. The British government, responding to growing concern about household food waste, commissioned a detailed study of how much edible food British consumers were throwing away each year. The results, published by an organisation called the Waste and Resources Action Programme, were genuinely shocking to many people at the time. British households were throwing away approximately 6.7 million tonnes of food per year. A significant proportion of this was food that had never been opened, still in its original packaging, still within its use by date, simply purchased and then forgotten or ignored. The study found that the average British household was spending approximately £420 per year on food that was thrown away uneaten. £420 per household per year, thrown directly into a bin. The government responded with public awareness campaigns, cookbooks about using leftovers, advice about meal planning, guidance about understanding date labels. All of it sensible, all of it well-intentioned. But here is what the campaigns could not do. They could not give people the felt knowledge of what it means to not have food. They could inform, they could instruct, they could appeal to environmental concern or financial self-interest, but they could not replicate the visceral understanding that comes from having genuinely not had enough, from having stood at a kitchen counter with a rationed allocation and understood in your body rather than your mind that what you had was all you would get. That understanding cannot be taught, it can only be lived, and the generation that lived it is almost gone. I want to talk about something that sits at the intersection of food and memory in a way that I find both scientifically fascinating and deeply human. Smell. Specifically the relationship between smell food and wartime memory. Neuroscientists have understood for decades that the sense of smell has a uniquely direct connection to the brain's memory and emotional processing centers. The olfactory pathway, the route by which smell information travels from the nose to the brain, bypasses the thalamus, which acts as a relay station for most other sensory information, and connects directly to the amygdala and hippocampus. These are the structures most deeply involved in emotional memory in the formation and retrieval of memories that carry strong emotional content. This is why smell is uniquely powerful as a memory trigger, why the smell of a specific food can transport you instantly and completely to a specific moment from decades ago in a way that looking at a photograph of the same moment cannot. For the wartime generation, the smells associated with both scarcity and abundance carry particular and intense memory charges. Researchers who have worked with elderly survivors of the wartime period in Britain, in the Netherlands, in Germany and Japan have documented remarkable consistency in the foods whose smells carry the most intense memory associations. Fresh bread baking is almost universally cited not just as a pleasant smell, but as an emotionally overwhelming one for people who spent years without access to fresh bread. The smell of real coffee, for Europeans who spent years drinking ersatz grain beverages, carries a charge that people who have always had access to coffee simply do not experience in the same way. One Dutch researcher who worked with hunger winter survivors described an experiment in which elderly participants, people in their 80s and 90s who had lived through the 1944-45 famine as children, were asked to smell various foods and describe their reactions. When presented with the smell of fresh bread, several participants became visibly emotional. One woman, 91 years old, began to cry. When asked to explain, she said in Dutch, something that translates roughly as "this is the smell of when it was over." The smell of when it was over. Bread for this woman did not simply smell like bread. It smelled like liberation. It smelled like the end of the thing that had defined the most formative years of her life. It smelled like the moment the world began to be safe again. Now here's a question I want you to sit with. What food carries that kind of weight for you? I do not mean your favorite food. I mean the food that carries a specific emotional charge, a memory, a feeling, a connection to a specific moment or person or time in your life that goes beyond its flavor or nutrition. The food that smells like something more than itself. Almost everyone has one, maybe several. And if you can identify yours, if you can trace the emotional meaning of a specific food back to its origins in your life, I think you will find that you understand something important about how food works as a carrier of human experience. Because that is what the wartime generation knew in ways that most of us have forgotten. Food is never just food. It is always also time. It is always also person. It is always also the specific texture of a specific moment that the act of eating or smelling or preparing brings back. The wartime table was in this sense a table dense with meaning, every meal freighted with the awareness of what it had cost, what it represented, what its absence would mean. And the post-war table at its best carried some of that awareness forward, a heightened sense of the gift of ordinary nourishment that people who had lived through ordinary nourishment being taken away were uniquely positioned to feel. There is one more legacy of the wartime food experience that I want to address, because it connects the past to a very specific and very contemporary conversation that I think is important. The wartime experience of food production, specifically the Victory Garden movement, and the related campaigns encouraging self-sufficiency in food-planted seeds, both literally and figuratively, that are still germinating in the early 21st century. The contemporary movements toward urban farming community gardens, farm-to-table eating and food sovereignty, the belief that communities should have control over their own food systems, draw on a tradition and a rhetoric that was developed in its modern form during the wartime campaigns of the 1940s. The language is different. The political context is different. The motivations are more diverse. But the underlying idea that growing your own food is an act of both self-sufficiency and civic virtue that the connection between a person and the soil that feeds them is worth cultivating, is an idea that the wartime garden campaigns helped make mainstream in a way it had not been before. When a young person in a city today tends a plot in a community garden, or grows herbs on a windowsill, or participates in a food cooperative, they are participating in a tradition that the war helped create. Not directly, not consciously, but through the long, winding transmission of ideas and values that travelled from the Dig for Victory posters of 1939 through the Victory Garden movement, through the environmental consciousness of the 1960s and 70s, and into the food politics of today. The war gave food production back to ordinary people, at least in concept, and that gift has proven surprisingly durable, something that sits quietly at the heart of everything I have wanted to say in this chapter. There is a moment that happens at certain family tables, you may have experienced it or witnessed it, when someone reaches to throw away a piece of food and an older person in the room reacts. Not dramatically, just a small tightening, a slight movement toward the food arrested mid-gesture, a look not angry, not scolding, just momentarily somewhere else that passes across their face before they compose themselves and say nothing or say something mild. That moment, that involuntary, almost imperceptible response to the discarding of food. I have come to think of it as one of the most honest windows into living history that ordinary life offers, because in that moment the older person is not in the present kitchen. They are somewhere else in a kitchen with empty shelves, or at a table with a measured portion, or standing in a queue with a ration book, or experiencing the specific cellular relief of having enough after a long time of not having enough. They are there and here simultaneously. And the food that is about to be thrown away is for one flickering moment not an inconvenient leftover. It is something that once in a time that their body has never forgotten would have been impossible to waste. We are living in the long afterlife of a war that ended 80 years ago, and one of the places where the afterlife is most honestly visible, most present, most real, is in the way the people who lived through it, and the people those people raised, and the people those people raised handle food. In the ceramic bowl on the counter, in the automatic scraping of a plate, in the inability to order more than can be eaten at a restaurant, in the specific quality of attention that some people bring to the act of cooking, not as performance, not as hobby, but as something that matters quietly and fundamentally in a way that does not always have a name. We have travelled a long way tonight, from the last normal breakfast of September 1939 through ration books and black markets, and ersatz coffee and starvation science, and liberations and reconstructions, and the slow, complicated return of the full table. We have met a schoolteacher in Paris who did not ask questions, a paediatrician in Warsaw who would not leave his children, 36 young men in a gymnasium in Minnesota who chose hunger so that others might be saved from it, a 91-year-old Dutch woman for whom the smell of bread is the smell of the end of the worst thing she ever survived. There is one final chapter left in this story, and it is perhaps the most personal one we've encountered yet, because it asks not what happened to the people of World War II, but what they left us, what we inherited without asking, what sits in our kitchens and on our tables, and in our habits and our reflexes and our complicated, unexamined feelings about food waste and abundance and the act of eating together, and what we choose to do with that inheritance now that we know where it came from. That is the question that closes this journey, and it deserves to be answered carefully, honestly, and with the same respect for the ordinary that has guided us through every chapter of this extraordinary story. We've arrived at the last table, not a wartime table, not the careful, anxious, arithmetically precise table of rationing and scarcity, not the desperate table of the occupied city or the frozen table of the Eastern Front, or the heartbreaking near-empty table of the ghetto. Not even the cautiously celebratory table of liberation, with its complicated mix of relief and grief and disorientation. The table I want to sit at with you now is a different one entirely. It is the table that exists right now tonight in your home, in your life, and the question I want to ask about it is one that I think this entire journey has been building toward. Do you know what is on it? Not literally. I do not mean the physical contents of your refrigerator or the meals you've planned for the week. I mean, do you know what your table carries? Do you know the history embedded in the ordinary foods you reach for without thinking? Do you know whose hands and whose hunger and whose ingenuity are woven invisibly into the food culture you inhabit as naturally and unconsciously as you breathe? Because after everything we have explored together tonight, after the ration books and the black markets and the starvation experiments and the liberation and the long, complicated aftermath, I want to make an argument, a personal one that I have been thinking about for a long time. The most important thing the Second World War left us in the domain of food is not a technology. It is not a recipe. It is not even a habit, though the habits are real and they matter. The most important thing it left us is a question that the people who lived through that war could not avoid, because the circumstances of their lives forced it upon them every single day. A question that we living in abundance have the luxury of ignoring and therefore the responsibility to choose to ask. What does food mean? Consider this. The United States Department of Agriculture estimates that the average American today makes approximately 226 food-related decisions per day. What to eat, when to eat, how much to eat, where to get it, whether to finish it, what to do with what remains. 226 decisions. The vast majority of those decisions are made without conscious thought. They are automated, habitual, driven by convenience, by marketing, by mood, by the specific arrangement of items in a refrigerator or on a restaurant menu. The average American spends, according to research from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, approximately 37 minutes per day on all food preparation and cleanup combined. 37 minutes to manage 226 decisions. This is by any historical measure an extraordinary situation. The human beings who lived on this planet for the vast majority of our species' existence spent a significant portion of every day thinking about acquiring, preparing, and preserving food. It was the organizing activity of daily life. Not a background task managed in 37 minutes, but the foreground, the primary occupation of enormous amounts of human time, energy, and attention. The war generation was the last generation for whom food required that quality of attention, as a matter of necessity rather than choice. The last generation for whom the question of what to eat tomorrow was not a lifestyle decision, but a survival calculation. The last generation in the wealthy countries for whom food was genuinely materially precious, not in the foodie sense, not in the artisanal small batch handcrafted sense, but in the simple, irrefutable sense that it was limited, that its limits were real, and that exceeding them was not an option. There's a woman I want to tell you about. Her name was Elsa Wendel, and she was a German housewife who kept a detailed diary throughout the war years and into the immediate post-war period. Her diary was discovered after her death and published in Germany in the 1980s. It is one of the most intimate and honest accounts of civilian life during this period that I have encountered. Else was not political. She was not an ideological supporter of the regime, but she was also not a resistor. She was an ordinary woman trying to manage an ordinary household in extraordinarily difficult circumstances, tracking prices, trading ration coupons with neighbours, recording with meticulous precision what she cooked and what it cost and how it tasted and what she wished she had instead. Her diary entries are dense with food. Week after week, month after month, year after year, the food situation is recorded with the attention of someone for whom it is the most pressing reality of daily life. What she managed to obtain, what she could not. The small victories, a piece of real meat, a quantity of butter acquired through a trade with a neighbour, and the long stretches of making do with almost nothing. And then in the summer of 1948, after the currency reform that we discussed earlier, Else writes an entry that I have read many times and that affects me differently each time. She describes going to a market and seeing for the first time in years food displayed in genuine abundance. Real food, vegetables in quantity, meat behind a counter, things she had not seen available for purchase in years. And she writes in German something that translates as I stood there for a long time and I did not buy anything. I could not explain to myself why. I just looked. I think I needed to look at it for a while before I could believe that touching it was allowed. I needed to look at it for a while before I could believe that touching it was allowed. That sentence is for me the emotional center of this entire story, because it captures in one woman's confused stillness in front of a market stall in post-war Germany the full weight of what years of scarcity does to a person's relationship with food. It makes abundance feel provisional, uncertain, like something that might be taken away again if you reach for it too quickly. Elle stood there and looked because looking was safe and touching felt like tempting fate. 6 years of scarcity had taught her below the level of conscious thought that food was not something you could simply assume would be available. That assumption, the ordinary, unremarkable assumption that most of us make every time we open a refrigerator without thinking, had been taken from her. And its return, even when the food was physically right there in front of her, was not instantaneous. Trust in abundance has to be rebuilt, and it is rebuilt slowly, imperfectly, and not always completely. Now I want to bring this all the way forward, to right now, to the world you're living in as you listen to this, because the lessons of the wartime food experience are not merely historical. They are not curiosities from a distant past that have no relevance to contemporary life. They are, if anything, more relevant now than they have been at any point since the war ended. We are living through a moment in which the global food system, the complex, fragile, extraordinary network of agriculture and logistics and technology and trade that puts food on your table, with the casualness of turning on a tap, is under pressures that would have been recognizable in their broad outlines to anyone who lived through the 1940s. Climate change is disrupting agricultural patterns in ways that are already measurable and will intensify significantly over the coming decades. Extreme weather events, droughts, floods, unseasonable frosts are affecting crop yields on every continent. Supply chain vulnerabilities exposed dramatically during the global disruptions of the early 2020s have revealed how dependent modern food systems are on assumptions of stability that cannot always be guaranteed. The global population, which was approximately 2.3 billion at the end of World War II, has reached 8 billion. Feeding 8 billion people requires agricultural systems of staggering complexity, operating at extraordinary efficiency. And those systems are, for reasons both climatic and political and economic, under increasing strain. I am not saying this to frighten you. I am saying it because I think the wartime generation, the people who figured out how to feed nations under conditions of genuine scarcity, who developed the victory gardens and the rationing systems and the creative substitutions and the communal cooking, understood something that we are going to need to understand again. Food is not guaranteed. The full table is a gift, not a right. And the skills and habits and attitudes that allow people to manage food wisely, to waste less, to grow more, to share equitably, to find creative solutions to supply problems, are not obsolete historical curiosities. They are capacities that the current moment may be in the process of requiring again. There is something I have been thinking about throughout this entire journey. A question that I want to put to you directly, because I think you are the right person to sit with it. When the wartime generation talks about food, the ones who are still alive to talk about it, there is a quality in how they speak about it that is genuinely different from how most contemporary people speak about food. It is not sentimentality exactly. It is not nostalgia, though there is some of that. It is something more like respect. A particular quality of attention and seriousness that comes from having understood through lived experience that food is not a given. We talk about food today in many ways. We talk about it as pleasure, as identity, as cultural expression, as health strategy, as social performance. These are all valid and genuine dimensions of what food is. But I think we have somewhere in the prosperity of the post-war decades lost or at least muted the dimension that the wartime generation could not avoid food as something that can be absent. Food as something whose presence cannot be assumed. Food as something that, when it is there, deserves in a very literal sense to be taken seriously. The wartime table was taken seriously, not because the people around it were particularly virtuous or wise, but because they had no choice. The circumstances of their lives forced a quality of attention onto every meal that our circumstances typically allow us to avoid. What would it mean to choose that attention, to bring it voluntarily to the act of eating not as a spiritual practice or a foodie affectation, but as an honest acknowledgement of the chain of labour and luck and history that puts food in front of us? I think it would mean something. I think it would change something small but real about how we live. Let me tell you how this story ends. Or rather, let me tell you that it does not end, because that is the truth. The woman in Warsaw who was making bread on the morning of September the 1st, 1939, the woman I introduced at the very beginning of this journey, standing at her kitchen window watching the first smoke rise, I do not know what happened to her. The story I told about her is a composite, a representation of the millions of real women who were in that specific situation on that specific morning. Their individual fates are as various as the war itself. Some of them survived, some did not. Some saw their children grow up and have children of their own. Some lost everything. Some rebuilt. Some carried their wartime food habits forward into peacetime kitchens in ways that their grandchildren still feel without knowing why. Some were freed of those habits by abundance and chose not to look back. But collectively, as a generation, as a human experience, what they went through has not disappeared. It is present in the ceramic bowl on a kitchen counter, in the automatic covering of leftovers, in the slight discomfort that some people feel at the sight of a restaurant plate returned to the kitchen still full, in the community gardens and the food banks and the zero-waste cooking movements, and the renewed interest in fermentation and preservation, and all the other contemporary practices that, whether their practitioners know it or not, rhyme with the wartime kitchen. The past is present. It is always present. It is in the food we eat and how we eat it, and what we feel when we eat it, and what we do with what remains. I want to close with something simple. Tonight after this journey, maybe do something small. Nothing grand. Nothing that requires significant effort or commitment. Just pay attention to one meal. Not to its flavour particularly or its presentation, or whether it fits your nutritional goals. Pay attention to its existence, to the fact that it is there, to the distance it has travelled from soil to shelf, to your table, to the labour embedded in it, invisible and enormous, to the history embedded in it longer and stranger than most of us ever think to trace. And if you have someone to eat it with, a family member, a friend, anyone, maybe acknowledge, even silently, even privately, that eating together is something that people have fought for, rationed, for smuggled, for grown in secret gardens, for stood in queues for and traded their most precious possessions for. that it is not ordinary even when it feels ordinary, that it is in fact among the most significant things human beings do together. The wartime generation knew this. They knew it because the alternative was not an abstraction for them. They knew it in their bodies and in their hands and in the specific hard-won relief of a full plate after a long time of empty ones. We know it in a different way, intellectually, historically, through stories like the one we've shared tonight. But knowledge is where understanding begins, and understanding is where respect begins, and respect for food, for the people who produce it, for the people who went without it, so that others might have it, for the everyday miracle of the full table, is not a bad place to end up after a long night of listening. So here we are, at the end of a journey that began with a woman making bread in Warsaw and travelled through ration books and black markets and frozen soldiers and starvation experiments and liberation days and post-war recoveries and the invisible inheritance that flows from grandparents to grandchildren through gestures rather than words. We have covered a lot of ground tonight. We have sat at a lot of tables. We have met people whose names history remembers and people whose names history has forgotten, but whose experiences were no less real, no less significant, no less worthy of our attention and our respect. If something in this story stayed with you, a detail, a name, a number, a moment, I hope you carry it forward, not as a weight, but as a kind of ballast. Something that keeps you connected to the reality that the full table is not inevitable, that the ordinary miracle of enough food is, in the long view of human history, genuinely miraculous. And if you find yourself sometime soon standing in front of an open refrigerator, illuminated by that particular cool light, looking at the abundance inside with the mild dissatisfaction of someone who has everything and wants something specific, I hope just for a moment you see Elsa Wendell standing in front of a market stall in 1948 looking at food she cannot quite believe she's allowed to touch. I hope you feel, just briefly, what it would mean to have been her, and then I hope you reach for something, gratefully, thoughtfully, with the quiet, unhurried respect of someone who knows, really knows what is on the table. Thank you. Thank you for spending this night with me, for staying through the difficult chapters and the hopeful ones, for listening with the kind of attention that these stories deserve. It genuinely means more than I know how to say. If this journey moved you, surprised you, or gave you something to think about, please share it with someone. Not for the numbers, not for the algorithm, though I will be honest and tell you those things do matter for getting these stories to more people. But because the stories themselves matter. Because history told carefully and honestly and humanely is one of the few things I know of that reliably makes us more empathetic, more connected, and more awake to the extraordinary ordinariness of being alive. Leave a comment telling me which moment from tonight's journey stayed with you most. Was it the Minnesota experiment, the child smugglers of Warsaw Else Wendell at the market, the unpeeled banana, the 40-minute biscuit? I read every comment, and those conversations between you and me and everyone else listening are genuinely one of the best parts of doing this. And if you have a story of your own, a grandparent's food habit that finally makes sense, a family recipe that survived the war, a ceramic bowl on a kitchen counter that you now understand differently, please share it. Those stories belong in this conversation too. They are part of the same history. There is another story waiting, another journey into the hidden, overlooked, deeply human corners of history that we think we know and almost certainly do not really, not in the way that staying up late and listening carefully in the dark allows you to know something. It is a story worth losing a little sleep over, and I will be here to tell it. Until then, eat well, eat thoughtfully, and take good care. Good night.